Hey, David here, Shavua Tov. We are back for Ask the Rabbi number 17. So thank God it's been a while. I wanted to try, I was thinking even to try to do regular weekly Ask the Rabbi, but I just didn't have it in me. Uh, there's a lot to, streaming takes a lot of effort and preparation, and also, psychologically, identity crisis, just to put myself out here, as a rabbi to a regular weekly audience. So I guess I will limit it to the actual release of research. And, the last few streams I cut a little bit short on my tour of my libraries, also do an AMA. So if anyone has any questions they want to ask, you can do at Duvid. I'll also hopefully put the link into the chat. And if people actually want to come on and have a conversation, maybe even a little debate. Yeah, Ray and John, Claire, thanks for tuning in. And I actually have an essay that to review for a week in review tomorrow, and it has quite a bit of Judaic stuff. So I haven't written an essay for a while. It's not complete yet. I haven't put it on my blog, and hopefully, over the next few days, I'll try to put it on the blog maybe by week in review tomorrow. And although it might have some further editing because there's a lot to it, but should be relatively interesting. So let me just do a quick screen share. And so here is duvid.com, in case people haven't seen it. It connects to my YouTube page, and it has all of my essays that were on the chess server or the Twitter review, which is no longer in operation. It's been discontinued. So Duvid has purchased duvid.com and made a little web page here, and you got some pictures about me, but you mostly just to host my blog. So hopefully tomorrow there'll be a new blog entry. And actually, I don't have a section here for Judaism. I have one on spirituality, and this one's somewhat spiritually oriented this week. And so you could see here 10 pages, 3,600 words. So lineage, high and low birth, and the problem of evil. Quite a bit of stuff from the Talmud and about Jewish theology. Here is my Ask the Rabbi series, going back 4 years from the very first one that had the Godword podcast and Brundlefly and Norvin Hobbs and more. And I got a few conversations with Claire Kaw. I had Professor Jonathan Pohl, the Post No More News show, God forbid, with Handsome Truth, almost in the news every day these days, and covering a whole bunch of different topics, conversion, half Jews, some of my own scholarship I've released or my research. I have more of these to put forward in the near future. And just to mention, 2 years ago, this week was Parshas Mishpatim, and 2 years ago I released my Ask the Rabbi on Reincarnation. And the reason I released it on Parshas Mishpatim is because reincarnation is alluded to in Parshas Mishpatim, specifically in relationship to the Levirate marriage. And God forbid, when someone dies without children, where the wife marries the younger brother, and the phraseology in this week's Moses reading is so that the brother can live through the child, and is understood in the Zohar to be referring to reincarnation. So in relation to part of today's topic about lineage and high and low birth is also the Judeo-Kabbalistic concept of high and low birth. And the topic I was going to do for today was somewhat in continuation of the last three topics. So just Ray, the Talmud there is some opinion within the Talmud and rabbinic literature that takes a significantly negative view towards Jesus. There's no definitive opinion among the rabbis about Jesus, whether Jesus even existed. So Charles Moskowitz liked to joke the origins of Jewish humor when Yechiel Paris was debating before King Louis. And he says, "Is every Louis in Paris King Louis?" And that there's a bunch of Jesuses mentioned in the Talmud, whether that's referring to Jesus Christ or Adam Green and his scholarship. There's no even consensus among the rabbis that Jesus even existed, although there's varying opinions, and many of those opinions are negative, that there was a Jesus and he was in fact a negative person. And Maimonides takes the view that Jesus was a false prophet and executed for his crimes. Others disparaging comments, although many of the leading rabbis held that we have no knowledge of whether even Jesus existed or what the status of Jesus is, to more modern opinions to say, like Jesus as a rabbi, Jesus as possibly one of the sages, and the whole gamut of opinions. Jim, shalom, shabbatov, good to see you. Thanks for tuning in. Okay, so the last few shows I had talked about the history of the Hasidic movement, and so I started it on Ask the Rabbi 14 during Hanukkah, where I started the history of the Hasidic movement and the very beginnings of the Hasidic movement. And 15, I talked about coming to America and the arrival of the Hasidic movement in America, and I spent a lot of detail going into the origins of just the population base of what was the Hasidic movement, how and why did it grow Eastern Europe, and I just show here this chart and graph that I went through extensively that shows the vast rise in population of Jews, mostly in Eastern Europe, and why Ashkenazic Jews dominate, or Eastern European Jews. John, we could talk about that more. So I'm going to cover a little bit of stuff. If everyone wants to talk about Jesus, it wasn't particularly the topic I was hoping to discuss, but if that's what people want to talk about, feel free to use the chat or pop in a question. So I went into in a lot of detail in the last Ask the Rabbis about the origins of the massive Jewish population, the Hasidic movement, how Hasidim and Jewish towns in Eastern Europe were organized, how some of the population came to America, the three waves of migration, the first wave of the small amount of Sephardim that came from the Dutch East India Company and the early traders before America, to the Germanic wave of the mid-18 to late 1800s, to the Eastern European wave that started in the late 1800s through World War I, and then the immigration limitations, and that there really wasn't a center of what we'll call Orthodox, yeshiva, rabbinic Judaism in America. There were some what we call Orthodox Jews that kept Shabbos and kosher and did the prayers, but there wasn't really any scholars or Rabbis in America till after World War II and the Holocaust. However, when the rabbis came over during the war and after the war, there was a large base of Jews in America that had Orthodox leanings and fell under the leadership of the new rabbis. And so I talked about the comparison to the yeshivas, the Litvish, so to say, the Orthodox non-Hasidim and the Hasidim. And the populations are about equal in terms of historical Eastern Europe and the division line. And, I showed a lot of the Jewish towns had almost none of the towns were completely Hasidic or completely Jewish. Most of them had a mixture of Jewish and non-Jewish population, varieties of Hasidic sects, and generic, we'll say, Orthodox Yeshivish Jews and Hasidic Jews. And in terms of American Orthodoxy, the majority of Orthodox Jews in America geographically are not Hasidic. They're Yeshivish. The Hasidim are generally confined to a few areas, mostly Metro New York, New York City. And you have a few Hasidim in Miami, Chicago, Los Angeles, but relatively almost all the Hasidim in America live in metropolitan New York City. However, you have, besides Chabad, and so my third stream, Ask the Rabbi, was specifically about Chabad. However, you have yeshivas all over America, and you have Lakewood Koilels, and hopefully I'll talk a little bit about that. And so in Ask the Rabbi 15, I did Coming to America, and then Ask the Rabbi 16, I talked specifically about Chabad and Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneerson. And so to somewhat complete the history, I thought I'd talk about the yeshiva system. And now most Hasidim have yeshivas, although the Hasidim, and we'll go and not cover too much of the history because I have other stuff I decided to talk about too. So you had the conflict between Hasidim and the yeshivish culture, like the Vilna Goan and Chaim Volozhin, who excommunicated the Hasidic movement even multiple times. However, eventually the yeshiva movement was taken upon by Hasidim, and now all Hasidim have yeshivas that are basically inherited from the Vilna Gaon and Chaim Volozhin that was originally opposition to Hasidus. And in terms of the mainstream Orthodox Judaism, like United Torah Judaism in Israel as a political party, or the Agudas Yisrael in America, that they're an umbrella branch for Hasidim and Litvish. So historically, there was a lot of disputation between Hasidim and Yeshivish, and there still is today. Like the modern Agudas Yisrael in America, there's disputation, and when the Novominsker Rebbe was the head, and now that Novominsker Rebbe has passed away, they have switched to becoming less Hasidic. In Israel, the United Torah Judaism is actually more Hasidic, but also usually is representative of the major yeshivas and Rosh Yeshivas, the Torah Council and Rabbinic Council of Sages. And so we'll see who shows up in the chat. We talk a little bit more about that, but that's why I want to somewhat to close this history of Hasidim, to include the history of the yeshiva system that has become fully incorporated into the Hasidic world. And we'll talk a little bit about the history of the yeshiva, Talmud study, and Pilpul, and a few various topics that are peripherally related. And then I have my other research on high and low birth in my essay, and I'll probably put the link in the chat if anyone wants to come on, or if you have any questions. So Virtual Asylum's back and wants to go more into the chicken swinging, Kaporos, God forbid, and he's claiming that does make the chicken suffer. And I said that it's not supposed to make the chicken suffer, that a lot of people do it in a way where the chickens suffer. However, that's more related to the generic process of slaughter in America where they purchase chickens in mass and they're brought in small cages, or they're treated comparable to the mass slaughter industry in America, that, God forbid, is comparable to how chickens are treated in America. But there's nothing within the ceremony itself about making the chicken suffer besides the fact that the chicken is eventually killed and the food supposed to be used to feed the poor. But there's no special thing. You're not supposed to make the chicken suffer. And if you're claiming to me that the majority of people who do Kippuros do it in a way that the chickens unnecessarily suffer, I will not argue with you. I might argue that it is generally within, God forbid, the normalized treatment of chickens, in the sense that people order as a business or for the Kippuros, they order thousands, tens of thousands of chickens, and they come in the small containers, and they're ordered from major companies that produce chickens. And so if they suffer, it's in line with the normal suffering, God forbid, that chickens go through with industrial slaughter. But there's nothing about the Kippuros ceremony that you're supposed to make the chicken suffer. And within the meaning of the ritual, a righteous, you should not cause the chicken to suffer. There's a specific commandment to Tsar Bilchaya of avoiding suffering to an animal. So, if you just want to make generic complaints, I can't actually argue with you, because I would say, yeah, most of the Kippuros is done in a way that the chickens suffer unnecessarily. However, from the view of the people doing it, that's in line with the normal amount of suffering that chickens go through anyways within American industrial slaughter. And I don't disagree with you that they don't deserve that. But I'm saying that the ceremony itself is not about making chickens suffer. That's due to the lack of care or standards of the individual people running the process. And they do it not necessarily because they're harsh on the chicken, but because that's in line. Maybe you treat your chickens better, but it's in line with who they purchase the chickens from and industrial slaughter here in the West. So kosher slaughter is illegal in many parts of Europe, but just saying, if you're a rabbi or a synagogue and you're trying to do Kippuros and you order chickens, and there's some kosher slaughterhouses, but they probably order the chickens from chicken wholesalers, and the chicken wholesalers that they order them from are not kosher farms. They order them from generic chicken farms and most likely industrial slaughter plants, and they come in, God forbid, those tiny containers where that's the way that they're purchased. And so the unjust treatment of the chicken before it comes to Kippuros has already been, God forbid, largely treated in a pretty poor way for its whole life, God forbid. John was mentioning yeshiva means sitting down, and the word mesifta also comes from sitting, and historically people sat in the dust of the sages, and you're supposed to learn in the feet of the sages. And you'll talk about the innovation of the yeshiva system a few hundred years ago that comes about. Virtually, you're just too negative. That's why I say you're unnecessarily attacking. I did condemn. The Bible condemns the unnecessary suffering of an animal. I will not condemn Kippuros. Kippuros is a meaningful Jewish ritual. I will condemn the unnecessary suffering that the chicken goes to, and I tried to explain the circumstances of which Kippuros exists here in urbanized United States, where most Kippuros rituals. And so I'm separating the suffering, unnecessary suffering that is commonplace within the practice of Kippuros, to the actual ritual itself and the meaning of the ritual. So if you have carelessness or just people that are acting according to the standards of the norms of society, so that's all I really have to say about that. Okay, so let me chant a tune, and I'm going to go a little bit into the yeshiva system, the history of the yeshiva system, some of the ideas about Pilpul, Torah study, the curriculum, and the history. And I'll try to give a long form history from ancient times till the Vilna Goan a few hundred years ago in Chaim Volozhin and the yeshiva system to the modern yeshiva system today. So let me make a quick bracha. So I will chant one of my favorite tunes from the Glen Rebbe that is from the liturgy for after Sabbath from Isaiah, Tzali Veroni, Yeshiva Section, Ki Gudel Bekirbe Kadosh Yisrael. Happy and happy are those who sit among Zion, Ki Gudel Bekirbe, because within our midst, Kadosh Yisrael, are the holy ones of Israel. Tzali v'raini Yeshiva Section, Yeshiva Section, Ki Gudel Bekirbe Kadosh Yisrael, Kadosh Yisrael. Tzali v'raini Yeshiva Section, Ki Gudel Bekirbe Kadosh Yisrael, Kadosh Yisrael. Tzali v'raini Yeshiva Section, Yeshiva Section, Ki Gudel Bekirbe Kadosh Yisrael, Kadosh Yisrael. Tzali v'raini Yeshiva Section, Yeshiva Section, Ki Gudel Bekirbe Kadosh Yisrael, Kadosh Yisrael. So chanting and singing is more Hasidic. You'll find among more the yeshivish much less chanting and singing, and even the gathering after Sabbath called Melova Malka is usually not celebrated among the yeshivish. Sometimes they'll wash and have bread and bench, say the grace after meals, but very common. It's rather uncommon to have a collective gathering outside of Hasidim for the meal after Sabbath. And although, like in yeshiva, a lot of times there'll be Shalosh Sudas, the last meal, everyone will gather and chant. There's very little chanting and singing outside of Hasidim. So your Friday night prayer service, a tiny bit Saturday during the day, and Shalosh Sudas, you'll have a little bit of singing. It's part of Judaism. Your weddings, special events, but outside of that, your chanting and your ecstatic prayer are not common among the yeshivish movement. So let me enter back screen share and let's look at a few things. So I didn't prepare extensive research and I have other things I want to cover. You just have the Wikipedia. I have some books on the subject. So, just to mention quickly, if people want to see a little bit more, check out the tour of my library, and I have 4 parts of my Jewish library, most specifically for this, my biography section. In my biography section, I cover a whole bunch of um, biographies of the great Rosh Yeshivas, the heads of the educational institutes, and also Jewish history. I have some books on the history of the Hasidic movement in general. But I didn't prepare any like special scholarships. I'll be saying some generic stuff. I know quite a bit of stuff on the topic. If anyone in the chat has any direct questions. So just looking at yeshiva, like John was sharing in the chat, yeshiva comes from the word to sit, and generally in the olden days, people sat on the dust, on the dirt, on the floor, and were taught Torah. In the ancient times, books weren't that common, and things were committed through memory. Maybe a few people had access to scrolls, and most of it was an oral tradition and had to be committed to memory. And you have the concept of what's called chavrusas, which comes from the root word chaver, which means friend, study partner. And generally in yeshiva, you have study partners, and the study partners will study a text together. There'll be a rabbi that officiates, and this is at Wikipedia, Mir Yeshiva. Duvid's an alumni of Mir Yeshiva in Jerusalem. I mentioned that Duvid was actually in the class of the Rosh Yeshiva of Nosson Tzvi Swinkel of blessed memory in Mir Yeshiva. So in a typical yeshiva, you will have a class that's given to a large amount of people. Varying size. You might have a small class that just has a handful. The larger classes could have hundreds or even thousands of students, a famous rabbi. So everyone in the yeshiva will generally be learning the same subject, at least for called shir, which like the section of the day. So the morning, like in a typical yeshiva these days, there'll be the morning prayer service, and that's usually like 7:30. Sometimes yeshivas will be like 8 o'clock, but usually like 7:30. There's prayers, then there's breakfast, and by 9 o'clock there might be class. And a lot of yeshivas, the very first thing is class, and the class might go on for a few hours. It might be all in the classroom, or it might just be an hour in the classroom, and then the people will go in what's called the base medrash, which will be like the synagogue room, a large room, and sit in pairs and study and discuss the text and their understanding, and so to say, debate out their understanding. And within the study hall, there will be various rabbis that are studying or walking around that can answer questions and resolve disputes. So in most Litvish yeshivas, in the morning, they will learn a section of Talmud slowly and in depth with as much commentary as possible. And it could be over the period of a whole semester. They might only learn a few pages or one chapter of the Talmud. And sometimes in the afternoon, it's the same, but a different chapter, or there'll be what's called Be'in and Bekitzer or Bekias, which slow and fast. So in the morning, you might learn one section of Talmud in depth. In the afternoon, quicker without going in depth to cover more material. So if you're learning, like a Talmudic tractate, that in the morning, so over the whole semester, so like usually going from the Jewish holidays, say starting from the main semester, starting from after Sukkot through Passover, there'll be one tractate, and in the morning over the whole 6 months from Sukkot to Passover, they might just learn one chapter, maybe not even finish the whole chapter, and try to learn it in depth as possible with as many commentaries as possible. And then in the afternoon, there would be quicker learning where you might finish multiple chapters and you have a hope of finishing the whole Masechta of, so it's a smaller Masechta and, being scheduled. And some Hasidic yeshivas has said, like these days, ironically, Hasidim are more likely to study halacha, which means might study it in the morning Talmud and in the afternoon halacha or koilel or various ways. But the structure, usually you have a big class and then you have divided where you have a study partner, and you usually have different study partners. So sometimes you could have 3 or 4 different sections. You might have a morning Seder, an afternoon Seder, and a night Seder. Sometimes you could add in like a 4th one, like a Musar Seder, and they might be of different periods of time. Sometimes they could be as long as 3 hours. So when I was in Mir Yeshiva, a study session was generally a full 3 hours, that you met your study partner in the morning and you sat with each other for a full 3 hours every day for the whole semester. And you learned the same chapter of the Talmud. And the afternoon might also be a full 3 hours. And they might night Seder, that might be an hour and a half. And other yeshivas that, like in the more serious yeshiva, you sit with the same guy for like 3 hours straight and study the same text. And the more modern yeshivas, or we'll talk a little bit more about that soon, it might be like hour sessions, and there might be more people than but typically people would have different study partners. You wouldn't have the same study partner all day every day. You would have a morning study partner, an afternoon study partner, and a night study partner. Sometimes your night study partner might be the same as your morning or afternoon, but a lot of times they would all be different. And sometimes it might even be divided where between a more senior student and a junior student. Usually the main morning student would be someone from the same class, so to say, an equal partner. In the afternoon also usually equal, but sometimes divided where you would be studying with someone more senior or more junior. And also at night, because there's always kind of you're learning from people more senior and teaching people more junior, and that could be based on scholarship, but is usually based purely on age. And this system probably dates to ancient times, where so you have the origins of the yeshiva. The Talmud says, so there's 2 different aspects to yeshiva. There is the education of children, the training of rabbis, and adult education. So generally there has always been collected, sometimes they're connected also, but there's always been education of the children and local rabbis who specialized in educating children. There's always been institutes, we'll say from the Second Temple period, the rise of Rabbinic Judaism. The time of the First Temple, there's disputes about how things operate, even in terms of the Second Temple or the rise. Some people claim that the yeshiva system largely dates after the destruction of the Second Temple. There's a statement, it says here in the Gemara Megillah, that's considered Jewish law. For every 10 adult men, there should be one person learning full-time, supported by the community. It's an obligation of the community collectively, where you have 10 adult Jewish men, that 9 of the adult Jewish men should sponsor the 10th to be involved in full-time studies. It doesn't mention here, there's also, in the Torah, the relationship, some say between Esau and Jacob, but between Jacob's two sons of Yisachar and Zvulun, where they had an agreement where, I have to look it up even which one was which, but where one was in the tent and studied, and one went out and worked and supported the other, and served a mutually beneficial relationship where the one who sat and studied and thought was able to advise the one who went out and worked. There's also possibly statements about Jacob and the Yeshiva Shem V'Aver, that Jacob spent studying Shem, of the three sons of Noah and his son Aber. But generally, we'll say in the second temple period, this understanding that among every 10 adult Jewish males, it is incumbent and required to financially support one to full-time academic study, and that person will fulfill certain rabbinic functions within the community. And one of those could include the education of children. And so if you have a small town that only has 10 people, maybe that one person's your rabbi, so to say, that 9 people work if it was agricultural, and from their excess supports one person that is involved in full-time study and fulfills the rabbinic function of the community. In a larger city, you would have a collection of substantial amount of people involved in study supported by the community. So like high IQ Jewish community, the value of education. So say we're the people of the book, we value education so much so that it's considered a requirement of the Jewish community of every 10th person to be supported in intellectual pursuits. And that 9 every 10 people, one of them should be supported full-time to pursue intellectual pursuits. So if you had a town of 1,000 people, that means that the community should support 100 of those people pursuing intellectual pursuits, and that's adult males. And a lot of times those adult males that are supported by the community are the ones that are also involved in teaching children. But in the whole series of rabbinic function and rabbinic training, and also what we'll call studying Torah for its own sake. And for the advisement of the community, when issues come up and complicated things about what people should do, that you want people who have scholarship, who have studied the text, who have thought about the important issues, that maybe have regional connections, that occasionally go to regional hubs or centers and have access to be able to consult. In ancient times, like the Megillah also mentions, nowadays we have Torah readings on Monday and Thursday. Historically, you had traveling rabbis that went to towns on Mondays and Thursdays to answer questions. So if you were a Jew in the countryside of Israel, 2 days a week, rabbis from the bigger cities would come to town and answer the rabbinic questions and give advice to fulfill the needs of the local community. So if you were, if you was a central town that has 1,000 people, and therefore there's 100 people involved in scholarship, one of the duties of those 100 peoples would be to travel through the countryside and serve the rabbinic needs of the Jews in the countryside. So you were talking about the historical origins of the yeshiva, and this is before the Talmud. So, obviously, I talked about, Lubavitch in the History of Hasidim Part 3 about the royal bloodlines and the belief in the descendants of David and Messianism, that the second temple, when it was rebuilt, there was no reestablishment of the royalty, but there was a recreation of the Sanhedrin, which was the central rabbinic body that had 70 judges and sat in the temple and made the most important judgments, which included declaring the new moon, setting the calendar. You could have included questions of war, diplomacy, and the death penalty. Although in reality, a local rabbinic court, I think it was 23 judges, could 27 judges, I forget the number, to meet the death penalty out. So you had regional size of rabbinic courts. So you could have a small rabbinic court that just means 3 qualified adult Jewish males, to a regional center of various size, to the temple where sat 70 learned elders. And these learned elders, some of them, for the learned elders, it was actually required to be a judge. You were supposed to be independently wealthy. So it could be separate from this 1 out of 10 people that are supported by the community, to say that if there's independently people that are wealthy and could support full-time scholarship without working, does that qualify for the 1 out of 10 or the certain parts? So there's a little difference in the judges, that the judges were supposed to be independently wealthy, not people who were being supported for their study. But if you didn't have people that were independently wealthy and scholarly to serve as judges, most likely you had these rabbis who were being supported by the community to serve as judges, and where you had the central rabbinic court in Jerusalem of the Sanhedrin, going back to the building of the Second Temple. According to the Talmud, the Sanhedrin was established by Ezra, Nehemiah, Mordecai. They actually sat in the first Sanhedrin, Simon the Righteous, and various people mentioned in Pirkei Avos. And you had 2 positions. You had the Nasi, which literally means prince, and was reserved for a descendant of King David. And this system is going to go into Babylon with the Babylonian exile, where we talk about well into the Islamic era, till about 900, till the switch of the center of Judaism into Europe and the rise of what we call the Rishonim, the Goanim era, has the center that moves to Babylon after the destruction of the Second Temple. But this system where you have a center institute of higher study, where you have people studying and training, you have the Sanhedrin of the 70 sages, you have the head of the Sanhedrin, and you have the Nasi position, which is reserved for someone of royal blood, descendant of King David. And so Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi is, Nasi, he's a prince, he's descended from King David, he's the official prince of Israel. There's not a king of Israel, and even in the time of the Second Temple, you don't have a king of Israel, you have a prince of Israel that you didn't, even though the Second Temple was rebuilt, there wasn't the capability of reestablishing the kingship of Israel, so you just have the position of Prince of Israel. So in the central yeshiva, you have the main Sanhedrin, rabbinic court of 70 judges, and then you have the Prince of Israel, the royal seat of the house of David, and then you have 1 out of 10 people that are involved in full-time study, at least theoretically. So in Jerusalem, during the Second Temple, if there's theoretically, and it's unclear historically how this actually worked. We're saying theoretically, if there were 200,000 Jews living in Jerusalem, that meant that you should have had 20,000 people engaged in adults engaged in full-time study. Although, those people would have had tasks, like they're not just sitting there necessarily reading all day, every day. They would have had to travel the countryside, serve as judges, educate children, and other ministerial duties. Oswald, how many royal Jewish bloodlines are? I'm not sure about the blood types of the current, so when you're talking about current people, there's been extensive studies on Kohanim. There are organizations and gatherings of people that have lineage based on King David. They have some sort of committee that attempts to decide how valid the person's lineage is. I'd have to look in I'm not sure if they actually have had blood studies, but it would be similar to the Kohanim because that means son after son descendantship. And from what I understand, just from the gatherings or people that claim, there's tens of thousands of Jews today that have reasonably well-established, recognized, so to say, Jewish royal blood from the house of King David, similar to Kohanim. And within the rabbinic class, a large portion of the rabbinic class, maybe 20-30%, are descendants of King David. Although I'm not familiar with any genetic studies, I wouldn't doubt that there is some. I haven't looked into it. But that's only mildly important for what I'm talking to today. But it's more likely that the people that are going to be chosen to be the 1 out of 10 for full-time study are going to be from the descendants of King David, but it's not necessary. It's not a requirement. And but disproportionately, so to say, the people within the Jewish community that are supported for full-time study are disproportionately descendants of King David. In most of the rabbinic dynasties, I don't know most, but maybe half of the rabbinic dynasties are also descendants of King David. But there's no necessarily role position besides for the messianic belief that Messiah will eventually return from one of the descendants of King David to actually, having a rabbinic duty. There's no necessity today that someone serving a rabbinic function needs to be descended from King David. In Hasidic folklore, some people believe that to be a Hasidic Rebbe, you need to be descended from King David, like you need to be Messiah eligible, and it's somewhat of a messianic role. But I discussed that at length in the last video. I'm not sure if you call it blue blood. So today there, say it might be preferable you want to marry within the Davidic line. There's superstition, but practically there's no role today of the Davidic bloodline, but it's a respected bloodline, and the majority of rabbinic dynasties come from the Davidic bloodline, and a disproportionate amount of the rabbinic class in general comes from the rabbinic bloodline, and all throughout history so I'm mainly focusing on this statement of Jewish law that for every 10 adult Jewish males, 1 should be supported in full-time study and part of what we call the rabbinic class. And so just that class is made up disproportionately of people from the Davidic bloodline is not necessarily important to the function of the test. Like even if there was no one from the Davidic bloodline, so if you're in a town of Jews and there's no one in your town that's descended from the Davidic bloodline, you should still have someone supported by the community to do full-time learning, and there's no requirement to be from the Davidic bloodline to be a rabbi. Anybody could be a rabbi from any bloodline, from any your Jewish bloodline. So this, in the terms of the text, after God forbid the destruction of the temple, and you have the establishment of Gamla and the whole story where I think it's Rev Gamliel, I'm slipping, I apologize, the exact names, that slips out and meets with Vespasian and convinces him to spare a certain amount of rabbis and allow them to establish a town in northern Europe as a rabbinic center. And so after the destruction of the temple and the Bar Kokhba revolt, where Judaism and Torah study is outlawed in Israel, there's one Roman protected center, and that's where Rav Yehuda HaNasi around 200 AD is, and writes the Mishnah. And then most people say that Rav Yehuda HaNasi was a contemporary and friends with Marcus Aurelius. And there's legends that there's a secret tunnel from Rome to Israel in meetings. So we'll avoid the legends for today. But so this dogma that was unclear how much it's been followed. In modern times, it's more than that. So say even here in Metro Detroit, it may even be higher than 1 out of 10 among the Black Hat Orthodox Jews. And certainly, like in Jerusalem, it's probably on average like 3 or 4 out of 10 adult Jewish males are involved in full-time study. And it's a big issue in Israeli politics with not serving in the military and government funds. And we're not just talking about like as a young adult, we're talking as a lifetime scholarship rabbinic post. And not even necessarily like a position of an official rabbi, but a house of study. So like here in Metro Detroit, usually it's referred to as a koilel. So yeshiva usually refers to, they'll call yeshiva katana, yeshiva gedola, and mesifta. And we'll get into that later, where you have up to the bar mitzvah age and people being bar mitzvahed, to a high school, to adult non-married students, to people who are married and continuing their studies, to respected adult rabbis that spend their full time in study. So even just here in Metro Detroit, we'll talk about this later, the Lakewood Koilel system, and mentioned in the biography videos of Aaron Cutler and the establishment of Lakewood Koilel all over America, that most urban Jewish communities have what's called the Lakewood Koilel. I mean, it's a satellite from the Lakewood, New Jersey yeshiva and students over of Aaron Cutler, and that system where you have adults that study at least half a day their whole life till they die. And so here in Metro Detroit, maybe there's 20, 30 people associated in the koilel, and they're not like 30-year-old men. A lot of them are 50, 60-year-old men, and they've been in koilel their whole life. And then you have the yeshiva itself that also has a koilel, and a lot of those people in the yeshiva koilel are also the rabbis that teach the high school and junior high school or young children, and they might spend half of the day in study and half of the day in education. And like I was saying earlier, that in a typical yeshiva, you have the rabbi gives class in the morning, and in the afternoon, the students, if they have English, they might go to English classes. But if they don't have English classes, they'll sit in the base medrash and study with a partner, and the rabbis will study in the koilel. However, the rabbis will be available to assist the students should they need help. Some of the rabbis might learn with students, but the rabbis are engaged in their own full-time learning, and usually half the day. So even the rabbis that teach in the yeshiva are usually engaged in full-time study. No, John, I think it's Vespasian who destroyed the second temple. So the legend in the Talmud is one rabbi sneaks out in the grave and meets with Vespasian and tells him that he's about to become emperor, and then he gets word that it was Nero or the other previous Roman emperor died. So that Vespasian would have been about 70 A.D. Marcus Aurelius would have been about 200 A.D. But I have to look this up. So I didn't prepare the exact historical accuracy of this. I mean, Vespasian 70 A.D. and we're talking the destruction of the temple to where the system collapses and all of rabbinic Judaism is either exiled mostly into Babylon, where the main yeshiva system is reestablished in Babylon, and the Sanhedrin moves to Babylon. However, you have a rabbinic center in Gamla in northern Israel, and that's where Rabbi Yehudi Nasi is. And I said Nasi, meaning he was the prince, he was a descendant of King David. But then also the Sanhedrin of the 70 rabbis is reestablished in Babylon and the main yeshiva system. And then later there's dispute between the rabbinic assembly of Israel and Babylon. But so that's, generally, in yeshiva, you study the Babylonian Talmud. There's a Yerushalmi Talmud, which is the sayings of the rabbis that remained in Israel. but the main study is the Babylonian Talmud, because the main rabbinic center after the destruction of the Second Temple moves from, Yavna, not Gamla. Yavna, not Gamla. I apologize about that. Although Gamla is related to Yavna. I think Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was in Gamla, but Yavna is the center that Vespasian allows the Jews to establish after the destruction of the Second Temple. But the main rabbinic center of the 70 rabbis and the prince moves to Babylon, and the vast majority of the Jewish population is in Babylon. So the center in the Talmud and Megillah, so the Mishnah of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi is the recording of the rabbis up till about 200 AD, which are called the Amorim, the Amorim, and then you have the apologies, these names are slipping me offhand, and then you have the rabbis in the Talmud from around 200 till 600, and the majority of that's the Babylonian Talmud and the Yerushalmi Talmud. So the Babylonian Talmud has the rabbis that were in Babylon, mostly Surya and Pumbedisa, and the Yerushalmi rabbis are in Yavna, Gamla, and the countryside. And as the Romans make it illegal to study Torah and be a Jew, that's the martyr of Rabbi Akiva and Shimon Bar Yochai, and but just in terms of the origin of yeshiva, it goes back to Second Temple period Israel, and then in Babylon, but it's usually of a different form, that you would have your main population centers. I don't know population estimates. So obviously I said in like Jerusalem, before the destruction of the temple, in greater Jerusalem, there was probably a few 100,000 people. And in even various centers like, Bnei Brak, the rabbinic centers mentioned in the Mishnah, some of those had tens of thousands of people. And that means that you had houses of study that included hundreds or thousands of people, and that the main institute of study in Jerusalem, in the Talmud in Babylon, potentially had thousands of people. You had a whole 70, and it actually goes into detail about the seating order and how it worked. Like Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai are like yeshivas. So the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai were institutes of study related to this principle of 1 out of 10 adult Jewish males. Shalom down. God forbid. God forbid. God forbid. But thanks for tuning in anyways, Don. So, and Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai were competitive yeshivas, and they both had probably hundreds of people in them all day, every day. And the story of Hillel, where he froze, listening in from the window, it would have been this institute. So Hillel at the beginning would not have been one of the 10 adult males that was chosen to be financed for adult study, and he was listening outside the window and froze, and they brought him in, or various stories. But so the house of Hillel, Beit Hillel, and Beit Shammai refer to their yeshivas, and there are probably hundreds or maybe even thousands of people on a regular basis studying in this. And they had the Chavrusa system, and they had lectures where they had senior rabbis that would give lectures or answer questions. And we'll talk more about that system. In many ways, the system is, I'll talk about, I'm going to get to eventually, the Vilna Goan and Chaim Volozhin and the modern yeshiva system, but a lot of it is based on the Second Temple Talmudic yeshiva system. And so that's why I'm going into rather fine detail about what was happening in ancient Babylon. So you had Surya and Pumbedita, where you had the main yeshivas, rabbinic centers of the rabbinic court and adult education. Although every town of Jews, small town of Jews that had more than 10 Jews, that had more than 100 Jews, then you have a minyan. And they're also part of having a minyan, part of the goal, your role. So if you have a town of 100 Jews, you should have a house that has 10 people in it regularly, and then there's a minyan. So hopefully a minyan, everybody from the town comes, but you have an established minyan of the people being supported to learn. And there's other obligations like saying Kaddish and praying for the sick, and sometimes raising money for the poor, taking care of orphans, distributing charitable funds, a whole bunch of obligations that come. However, in a Jewish town that has over 100 people, 100 families, 100 adult males that have over 100 families, you would have like a Lakewood Koilel, ancient version where you would have a house of study that may also be the house of prayer, and you would have a regular minyan there where you hopefully have, even if there's a town of 10 Jews, hopefully they would be able to organize and prioritize to make a regular minyan. But if you have a town of 100 Jews, you could have paid and financed by the community by rabbinic dictate to always have a minyan. And this system largely lasts until the Vilna Goan. And there's some part in Eastern Europe, we'll talk about the origins of Pilpul. But the ancient centers where you possibly had, so to say, yeshivas, where you had even thousands of rabbis, and not just talking children being educated or rabbinic training, but adults who were involved in full-time scholarly learning, maybe similar to the Academy of Plato or something like that, where you're not just talking about like a university, although a lot of times they're connected, the education of the youth and rabbinic training to the academy, but you're talking about an institution of advanced scholarship mainly for adults. And so this, some people might argue that it actually comes from Plato's Academy, because it comes into Judaism in the time of Greek domination over Israel. So you're neither here nor there, just mentioning that a lot of scholars, even Israeli scholars, claim that the yeshiva system actually comes from Socrates and Plato's Academy and the Greek occupation of Israel. And so there is some crossover in comparison. Think like, here's a modern yeshiva, but this house of study to actually be a descendant of Plato's Academy, Socrates' Academy. Okay, so the long gamut of Jewish history, where you have the destruction of the Second Temple, the Bar Kokhba and Quito rebellions, and the making illegal of the practice of Judaism and Torah study in Israel, to the main center of Judaism being in Babylon. You had, for a period of time until the Quito rebellions, you had a main center of Judaism across North Africa and in Alexandria. And there were some Jewish community like Alexandria in Egypt, but at some point that largely dies out, and the main Jewish center is in Babylon. And that continues through the Islamic Golden Age, and Jews travel to Europe through North Africa, mostly with Muslims. Well, I've talked about in other videos the history of the Radhanites, the slave trade, the origins, the first Jews in Europe. However, the rabbinic class, similar to America, where I said there was already 2 million Jews in America before the rabbinic class starts coming over. So in Europe also, you have Jews arriving in Europe before the arrival of the rabbinic class. And the rabbinic class largely arrives with the Muslims starting in Spain, some in Italy, around the turn of the millennium. And this refers to the Rishonim. And like Rashi, and generally you don't have large yeshivas. So the period of Europe till the Vilna Goan, you don't usually have large institutes. You have centers where there's Jewish population, and I've shown in the Jewish population charts, there weren't really huge Jewish population centers. So like in Paris, even Paris, when they burnt the Talmud in the disputation between Yechiel Paris and Nicholas Dunnan, maybe there probably weren't even 10,000 Jews in Paris. And so, say theoretically, if there were 10,000 Jews in Paris, there may have been 1,000 Jews in full-time learning, and it's unlikely that there was one institute. So if Yechiel Paris was the senior rabbi of the Jewish Institute, you'd have to look for population estimates. There's probably thousands of Jews. Maybe there were hundreds of Jews involved in full-time learning, and they probably were dispersed over farming communities or in urban areas. There's not enough evidence that there was even a center of likely many hundreds of Jews studying together. And most of the Jewish communities exist, like Rashi, across smaller towns, farming establishments, suburban Jewish sections of towns where you might have a few hundred Jews, you might have 10 Jews learning together, and there might be one advanced scholar. And a lot of times those scholars were independently wealthy and also had to work. But in the early Rishonim, you had, like in the Bali Tosfos all across Germany and France, you had mostly Jewish communities that had hundreds, maybe thousands of people, maybe like Paris, or a few of the communities maybe had a few thousand Jews, but almost all of them, unlikely even had more than a few hundred Jews, many of them less than 100 Jews. So that the likelihood they would have even had an institute that included more than 10 people studying together was rare. However, you had some regional experts. So you would have, like I said, like the dictate of 10 adult males, you would have one that would be supported by the community for learning, and that rabbi would most likely be affiliated with the duties of educating children. And a lot of times it would have been done in their house. And, so like the children of the community, maybe they would have set aside a building, and it would have been the synagogue. So the synagogue would have also served as, called like the cheder, the room where the children got together and were educated in, Hebrew, the mitzvahs, basics of Judaism. And it could have been, the rabbi himself that was in charge of educating the children, or if it was a larger community that had multiple adult males studying, they probably were kept busy mostly with education of the youth. However, you had senior scholars and you had certain centers. So famous rabbis, like Rashi, Rabbeinu Tam, Meir Rottenberg, the Bali Tosfos, you might have had the serious students from the whole regional area that would gather together in a town for a period of a few years to be trained as rabbis in an institute, but usually they only had tens of people. That most, like from till the Vilna, till Eastern Europe, and you will talk about Prague and your various centers in Eastern Europe, where you start to have the rise of larger institutes of Jewish learning. But the main period of the Rishonim, you don't have large gatherings of Jews and learning, and you have isolated scholars that keep correspondence with each other. And we have a lot of these correspondence have survived till today, that you're writing, or that you might have just a handful of adult Jewish males that spend their whole life in education and writing books and answering questions. And they would write back and forth to each other for clarifications on questions. They would write text commentaries, treatises, we called shilas and shuvas, questions and answers on the Jewish law questions of the day. And they would send their children to various places to be trained, depending on the situation or the abilities where there might have been various rabbis at various times that had the ability to be involved in the full-time education of adult rabbinic candidates, either older adult youth or newly married people that you were just starting to build up their family and could have been involved in full-time education. And then in the, as I mentioned in the other lectures, with the rise of Eastern European Judaism, I think King Casimir of Poland, the Polish-Lithuanian Empire. So really the population explosion of Jews doesn't start till the 17th century and about the time of the Vilna Gaon and the Hasidic movement. So even when you have the Maharal of Prague, you have the Kalmytsky massacres, you have a few 100,000 Jews, which is one of the larger conglomerations of Jews in Eastern Europe, and you might have the beginnings of some centers of learning. That's where the Pilpul method comes. It's disputed, like the historical origins, whether before the Vilna Gaon, even like in the Maharal or the various places in Eastern Europe where you had scholarship, Shabbatai Tzvi, Rabbi Landau and Katzenellenbogen, and Antwerp and Amsterdam, that it was unlikely you had large institutes of Jewish learning, that it had largely faded out from the Second Temple period in Babylon till the Vilna Gaon. And so the Vilna Gaon is really just an independent great scholar and sage and visionary, Kabbalist, so on and so on. So it's his student, main student, Rav Chaim Volozhin, who starts the first yeshiva called Volozhin Yeshiva. Volozhin is the name of a town in Belarus, and Chaim Volozhin moves from Vilna, which it was a large Jewish establishment, had a lot of synagogues, and probably had a lot of adult males being supported, involved in full-time study. But it was probably a disparate community of synagogue rabbis and sectarian leadership, and it didn't have the yeshiva system. And that's largely attributed to Rav Chaim Volozhin and the Volozhin Yeshiva. And the Volozhin Yeshiva is founded in 1803. So it's not that far ago. It's only 220 years ago, where you have the yeshiva system booming. And it's similar to the Hasidic movement. The Hasidic movement started 100 years earlier, and started by sending rabbis to various towns, and you're setting up dynasties and newly established ways of Jewish life. So after the Volozhin Yeshiva is established, where you don't just have synagogues, you have, till the Volozhin Yeshiva, almost all Jewish education takes place in synagogues. And you don't really have these advanced institutions for Jewish learning like you had in ancient times. But after the Volozhin Yeshiva, the first generation of students end up similar to the Hasidim, spreading out all over Eastern Europe and establishing yeshivas. So here, just a brief list, not even exhaustive, of the major Lithuanian yeshivas, and most of them are named after towns. And almost all of these, actually all of them, originate with the Vilna Gaon, Chaim Volozhin, to the first generation of disciples that, in a way parallel to the Baal Shem Tov, went to towns and established yeshivas, and then those towns, many of them established yeshivas that went out and established further yeshivas. And somewhat you have a parallel rabbinic dynasty similar to Hasidic Rabbis, although the role, hopefully we'll talk more about the Rosh Yeshiva. That's different than a Hasidic Rebbe, where the Rosh Yeshiva is more directly just involved in education, guidance, and answering questions, doesn't fill some sort of rabbinic role, is not necessarily given as esteemed leadership model position. There's a lot of parallels, or like the blessings, the miracle working is more directly involved in Torah education, creation of scholarship, and the answering of questions in Jewish law, than less so of directly in getting involved in leadership and spiritual leadership of the people. Though obviously there is some role of that, and you also have separated the town rabbi. So the Rebbe's somewhat make it a one-shop, where you have the rabbi is the rabbi of the town, the leader, and all of these roles umbrellaed into one person, the Rebbe, as opposed to most yeshivas, they had a separate rabbi of the town, so the Rosh Yeshiva, could focus purely on education without the leadership duties that Rebbes were usually occupied with. And in that sense, most of the Rebbes were not able to accomplish the same sort of scholarship as the Rosh Yeshiva. So just some of these names: Baranovich, Brisk, we'll talk more about, Gateshead, almost all these survived till today. Hildeshire, maybe we'll mention that took a more modern approach. I think Hildeshire mentioned that, where the biography of Yechiel Yaakov Weinberger, maybe that's where Avram Yeshua Heschel was at. Kamenetz, Kelm, Radomsk, Lamza, Chokma Yublin, Manchester, Novordik, Mir, where Duvid went, Nitra, Novordik, Pinsk, Panovich, Pressburg, Radin, Slobodka, Slonim, Slutsk, Kletsk, Telz, and Volozhin. So, obviously, God forbid, the Holocaust, there were millions of Jews in Eastern Europe, from the population explosion starting about 1700 up until World War I, you had millions of Jews. So these are major yeshivas where the rabbis learned in these yeshivas and then became leadership all over Europe. So, really there would have been, these were main yeshivas, and smaller towns similar to the olden days, where a small Jewish town, the education would have happened in the synagogue, and the handful of rabbis or people involved in adult education would have been involved in teaching the youth, like the Baal Shem Tov. The beginning was involved in teaching the youth in the local synagogue, or you would have had people from larger towns that traveled to smaller towns and served in education. So, if you were a more serious student, that at that time might have been like 13 or 14, even marriage up until World War I often happened at very young ages, even like 14 years old. That after your bar mitzvah, most of the time Jewish education stopped. But if you were a promising student or wanted to become a rabbi, if you came from one of these major towns that had a yeshiva, or you would have traveled to one of the towns that had a yeshiva. And, you also have things like the origin of the dormitory. And, so in the olden days, if you were in yeshiva, you would have to be sponsored by people in the town. And so it goes back to the Talmudic dictate that out of every 10 adult males, and that period of time could have included someone over 13 years old. 1 out of 10 people over 13 should be involved in full-time Torah scholarship, and that meant that they had to be housed and fed. So if you were in the yeshiva, you would have slept in one of the people in the community's houses or went to various people regularly to be fed. And these are, in the yeshiva's community, these are well-known stories of how things were before the wars. So within the yeshivas, you had what they call mahalak, and mahalak comes from the same word as halacha, which means to walk or to go. So different paths, different systems, and you will talk maybe about a few of them. So you had the Musar movement, where Israel Salanter in the Musar movement. You had Haskalah, like Hildesheimer, people that were more liberal and inclusion of more secular studies. You had the Brisker method. I'm going to talk about Pilpul. And you had rabbinic cult of personalities. So you have like the Alter Kelm, the Alter Slobodka, and major rabbis that have disciples that move across Europe and become the leading rabbis of all different towns. And even in America, we have the Alter Slobodka, the Alter Kelm, and their disciples that make up the majority of the rabbinic leadership of the next generation. And those people have what's called different mahaloks, different slightly paths of rabbinic style, learning style, and your world outlooks, Weltanschauung, or however you want to define it. Also mentioned here, like I mentioned, Rabbi Wolfson, Moshe Wolfson, in regard to Lubavitch, the famous Rabbi Duvid studied under. He was the Mashkiach Rukni at Torah Vadas. So you have the position of a Mashkiach Rukni, which, the Rebbe generally, this in Litvish, would have been like a spiritual guide that would give students spiritual mentorship about prayer, maybe marriage, what they want to do with their life, various positions. By the end of the 18th century, most Hasidic places start making yeshivas. So Chabad Lubavitch establishes Tomkei Tamima in 1897. So 100 years after the establishment of the Volozhin Yeshiva, you have the Chabad Yeshiva, and within that time frame, most of the Hasidic sects already in Europe start establishing yeshivas. And at this point, all Hasidim have yeshivas, just like the Litvish. There's no differentiation. They all have centralized houses of study. A lot of them have kollel of just adult males. So like in Brooklyn, like I mentioned in one of the earlier aster rabbis, like of rabbinic courts like Tartikov, Rabbi Babad descended to the Minchas Chinuch, and his kollel that has rabbinic court that also has tens of adult males involved in full-time learning and scholarship. And Spink, many smaller Hasidic groups, independent kollel, where you have adult males involved in full-time study. And then larger Hasidic groups like Belz, Bobov, also have kollel, and a lot of the people will be in kollel their whole life. But if you're in kollel, it's kind of like the army, up or out. That because you're being supported on the back of the community, most of those people enter into respected communal leaderships, giving public classes, serving on a rabbinic court, or heading up education services for the youth, or popularly answering questions for the masses at large. But at about 100 years after it was established, the Hasidim start the yeshiva movement, and slowly within decades, almost all Hasidic groups have yeshivas, to where today there's no difference between Hasidic and Litvish in yeshiva. The Sephardim, so you had the early yeshivas, but the Sephardic yeshiva movement really only happens a few decades ago. So, like, I remember in Israel and Jerusalem in the late 90s, they were building the largest Sephardic yeshiva. There were a few Sephardic yeshivas. I talked about that most Sephardim, like I said, most Hasidim, even till today, the Litvish yeshivas are considered superior yeshivas. So a lot of the Hasidic Rabbis studied in Litvish yeshivas, and the Sephardim almost all studied in Litvish yeshivas. So only within Israel in the last few decades have you had the establishment of Sephardic yeshivas. And in most of the Arab countries, you had similar to what was going on in Europe during the Middle Ages. And you didn't really you had respected scholars and learned people in places where the rabbinic leadership went to towns to study under rabbis, and synagogues that also served as places to educate the youth, and a handful of rabbis for the next generation. However, the yeshiva system doesn't really hit Sephardim until after the creation of the State of Israel, and it takes a few decades, maybe not even till the 70s or 80s, till you start legitimately having yeshivas. And now, like with the Israeli political party, the creation of Shas, the political party, you have funding for Jewish institutes of Sephardim that educate the youth. And really only in the last few decades do you have advanced senior institutes of Sephardi yeshivas. So it's an interesting topic. We return to it more. They're really not proper yeshivas. So in terms of, here you even have Bobov, this in Jerusalem. You don't really have proper Reform, conservative, even open Orthodox yeshivas. They're more kind of parallel to universities. They might have like a chavrusa system or study Talmud, and have taken some of the yeshiva system, but they largely operate more in a secular model than the historic yeshiva model. And so modern America, yeshivas are everywhere, like every major town, Metro Detroit, Baltimore, Chicago, even the smaller satellite, like Toledo, Cleveland, South Bend, Indiana. There's hundreds of smaller yeshivas set up across America. A lot of them, like I mentioned, Shlomi Feiger Mendelovich through Torah Vodaas sent rabbis across America already before World War II to set up yeshivas, like Yeshiva Beth Yehuda here in Detroit, that was established, I think, in around 1920, and was more involved in just the education of children. And then Rav Aaron Cutler established Lakewood in, I forget what year, maybe in the 60s or 70s, comes up with the concept of the Lakewood Kollel, where he sends senior rabbis to open up Kollel adult leadership training study houses in all the major Orthodox Jewish centers across America. So, say Metro Detroit, there's a Lakewood Kollel that is ran by students from Lakewood, and almost every major Orthodox center in America has yeshivas and Lakewood Kollels. As where the Hasidic movement has stayed more centered in Metro New York, and even like Miami, where you have Hasidim in Miami, the yeshiva system is weaker, and you have you might have like some like Satmar established, and they'll have a yeshiva katana or like a high school, and even the tendency among Hasidim is to go to Lakewood and Litvish yeshiva. So Mir Yeshiva today is like 25% Hasidic, and even Lakewood is maybe these days like 20% Hasidic, and the Litvish yeshiva system is in many ways considered superior to the Hasidic yeshiva system, and very often Hasidim will go and study in Litvish yeshivas today, which we've discussed in the past. So there's also, the Hesder in Israel. There's like the army, the modern Orthodox system that parallels like Rev Kook, and they're kind of like renegade disciples of the Vilna Gaon. So, the Zionist official rabbinate system are disciples of the Vilna Gaon that became Zionist and took it in a different leaning, in the same way that they might have, like the Hildesheimer incorporated secular learning. They've incorporated the state and military service into yeshiva, where they've go into the army and are offshoots of the Vilna Gaon's yeshiva systems, like the Hesder, the Yeshiva HaKotel, or the various yeshivas that modern Orthodox people go to. The modern Orthodox, like Yeshiva University, is from Rabbi Soloveitchik. It's an offshoot of the Vilna Gaon, although it's incorporated things like army service or secular education. You also have like so-called the Bali Tshuva Yeshiva that has mostly American or Israeli students that were brought up secular and are learning about Orthodox Judaism in their adulthood, like Or Sameach and Aish Torah. So let's briefly cover Pilpul. So just Talmud study. What is Talmud study? And the method of Talmud study. We'll talk about Pilpul. So Pilpul is not actually a Hebrew word, and actually it is a Hebrew word meaning pepper. Sometimes it means like sharp like pepper or spicy. And it's a form of textual analysis and attempts to explain conceptual differences between various legalistic rulings, or to reconcile any apparent contradiction presented from the various readings of the different texts. So the source of Pilpul, so if you look at the Talmud, you have various rabbis and rabbinic opinion, and over the years you have various communities and rabbis that form various schools of learning. And it's similar to what I talk about in relation to the multiple truth hypothesis, or like Chat GPT and decision trees, chess and candidate moves and analysis trees, where you have earlier disputes where there's multiple branches of opinions of rabbis, and then each of those opinions of the various rabbis branch out into more opinions. And it could be communal, like I said, the yeshiva, where you have one senior rabbi, like the Vilna Gaon, student Chaim Volozhin, and he builds up multiple students, and then they go to a whole bunch of different towns, and they establish yeshivas in ways that are all slightly different, and within those differences, the branches keep expanding. And from a Judaic opinion, like I've mentioned many times, Jews follow the sages of our generation. That there's the biblical law, the belief in prophecies, and the Talmud. However, from Moses himself, Moses commands that we should set up bodies of leadership and appoint sages, and the sages should make rulings, and we should follow the rulings of the leaders of our generation. However, the text, when you have scholarship that is brought, you do what the leaders of your generation tell you. However, scholars understand the historical progression from ancient times till modern times, and under difficult circumstances will look at the progression of how it got to the point where we're doing what we're doing today, from the biblical commandment, and the more ancient, the stronger the precedent. So, the laws of Moses are the highest form, like saying the source of legality is the laws of Moses. You can learn to understand the laws of the Moses from the prophets. Then you have the sages in the Talmud, starting with the Mishnah, then the Talmud, then the Goanim, then the Rishonim, and then the Achronim, starting about 1500. We have the Achronim going to modern times, and all because the biblical rabbinic belief in Yerida Sadoros, the decline in generations, the earlier, the more precedence. So if you have various rabbis of various communities saying different things, Pilpul is a method of finding the commonality and understanding, because you're not allowed to argue with the rabbi. So to say, okay, I might follow my rabbi, but I shouldn't degenerate the other rabbi. And so to say, God speaks through all of the rabbis, that you follow the leaders of the generation. You might have your rabbi that you submit to and follow their rulings. However, you should be submitted in understanding that God operates through all of the senior rabbis. And so the Maharal of Prague, from famous for the Golem, is actually anti-Pilpul, and from an aspect where what exactly is Pilpul, and they have Bilbul saying confusion, and the Maharal actually mentioned chess. It would be better to learn carpentry or another trade or to sharpen the mind by playing chess. At least they would not engage in falsehood, which then spills over the theory and into practice. The Reb Sholem Dovber Schneerson, the fifth Chabad Rabbi, talks about referring Pilpul. There's genuine Pilpul and false Pilpul. Genuine Pilpul is possible only when one first knows the simple meaning of the law guilelessly and in structured manner, using straightforward terms. Afterwards, if God has graciously endowed a person with a capable intellectual potential and broad-minded thought process, he may delve into Pilpul. If, however, a student will begin with Pilpul before he has genuinely appreciated the subject in the above manner, as a natural consequence, the Pilpul will be false and he will waste his time and thoughts. So I'm going to talk about some of these later methods, and it's somewhat unclear. Pilpul, and among the counter-Semites, Pilpul is largely used like a pejorative for mental gymnastics or trickery, but some Pilpul as a method of reconciling various opinions, and talking the spirit of the law, the progression of the law, the deeper meaning. And these days, Pilpul, there's what we call lumdus, which is like a deeper understanding, which also Pilpul, which is logical rabbinic exercise of saying, well, this rabbi says like this, and like the Lubavitch, when you say Torah, you say it in a sing song, and saying, well, clarify everything up, and to say the multiple truth hypothesis. How is it possible that both rabbis are right when they saying something contradictory? So one of the most famous yeshiva schools is Brisk, which is one of the disciples of Rav Chaim Volozhin, the Soloveitchiks. Soloveitchiks, most well known in America from modern Orthodoxy and Yeshiva University. However, in Jerusalem, Brisk is more ultra-Orthodox, and Soloveitchik, who started Yeshiva University, kind of went off the derrick in the Brisker path. And you have what's called the Brisker method. So here Wikipedia has the Brisker tradition in Soloveitchik dynasty. The Beis Halevi is one of the most famous yeshivish rabbis in the Beis Halevi, the house of the Levi, because the Soloveitchiks are Levium. And the famous book that is popularly studied in yeshiva till today, you also have things like Akiva Eger, but the Brisker system is probably the most famous. And starting with Rav Yosef Dov Soloveitchik, the Beis Halevi, and his commentary, and then he has multiple sons, and his sons, most notably Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, Rav Chaim Brisker, who heads the yeshiva in Brisk, and Yitzchak Zev, and the creation of the Soloveitchik dynasty till through today, with the main yeshivas in Jerusalem are the various Brisk yeshivas, the brothers, and considered the most advanced learning center, and even in America, from the creation of modern Orthodox Yeshiva University, and the Rav J.B. Soloveitchik, who ordained like 3,000 or 4,000 rabbis, and his student Aaron Schechter. But the Soloveitchiks, modern Orthodoxy in Yeshiva University is next to the Lubavitch Rebbe and their contemporaries. I mentioned Chaim Delphin's book, The Rav and Rebbe, ordained thousands of Orthodox rabbis, and rabbis at Young Israel's modern Orthodox Zionist congregations overwhelmingly across America come from Yeshiva University, and from the previous generation were mostly ordained by Rabbi J.D. Soloveitchik, the Lonely Man of Faith, one of his famous books. So the Brisker method, and I'll just read this from Wikipedia, is a reductionist. You could compare this to maybe like Derrida and deconstructionism, but this is a form of biblical hermeneutics. And yeah, Don, so I'm not too much following the chat, because if you have something at Duvet, I'm going to finish this in a few more minutes, and then I'm going to move into the other topic. I'll even put the link in the chat if someone wants to come on and talk real quick, or so I'll finish this in like 10 minutes. If anyone has any questions, you do an at Duvet. So the Brisker method is a reductionist approach to Talmud study, innovated by Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, as opposed to the traditional approach, which is rather holistic. It has since become popular and spread to yeshivas around the world. The Brisker method is also known as the conceptual approach to Talmud study, and is often referred to simply as lumdus, analytical study, or deep theory. Broadly speaking, before the Brisker method, Talmudic texts were taken at face value unless there was a compelling reason not to. If a contradiction between two texts was discovered, then it became necessary to reinterpret one or both texts in order to reconcile them. But there was no standard method by which to perform this reconciliation. Any explanation which one offered, which seemed reasonable, would be accepted. So Pilpul is not really methodical. So it's just kind of like intellectual, logical, like games or even trickery that aims at this reconciliation process, but it's not methodical in the same way that the Brisker method became methodical. And that's why Pilpul, was more controversial. The Brisker method replaces this approach with a methodical search for premise definitions of each concept involved in the discussion. Once the mechanisms by which a law works is rigidly and correctly defined, it can become clear that one aspect of the definition applies in one situation but not another. Therefore, the final law will differ in the two situations, even if they superficially appear to be very similar. Often entire series of disagreements among the Rishonim, the Talmudic commentaries from roughly 1,000 to 1,500, may stem back to a subtle difference in how these rabbis understand a line from the Talmud. The Brisker method can provide a precise formulation of how each Rishon understood the topic and thus account for their differences of opinion. This approach is most spectacular when a whole series of debates between two Rishonim can be shown to revolve around a single chakira, or difference in the understanding of a Talmudic concept. Another benefit of this approach is that it helps clarify the puzzling Talmudic statement that Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim chayim. Literally, these words and these words are the words of the living God. In other words, the Talmud advances an idea that no valid interpretation of its corpus is strictly wrong. Rather, a multitude of opinions can be justifiable put forth on a particular subject. According to the Brisker approach, this idea is explained in conceptual terms. Both opinions accepted the same facts, so none are strictly wrong. However, one opinion conceptualized the issues through one logical prism, whereas the other viewed the issue via an entirely different logical prism. It is easier then to accept that both opinions are divinely justifiable approaches, as their fundamental point of departure is theoretical rather than physical in nature. The Brisker method is not a total break from the path. Rabbis before Brisk sometimes made conceptual distinctions, and Brisker rabbis can still resolve issues without resource to terminology they invented. The difference is one of focus and degree. Non-Brisk analysis tends to formulate conceptual definitions only when necessary, while for Briskers, these definitions are the first and most common tool to be used when approaching a Talmudic issue. One example of Rav Chaim's emphasis on the value of precise definition can be found in a quote: "One approach which answers three different problems is better than three different approaches to individually solve the three problems." A corollary to Occam's razor. Examples. Some of the distinctions which follow may appear to be meaningless. The two alternatives are simply different ways of expressing exactly the same concept. This is indeed a significant danger when formulating Brisker concepts. Therefore, it is routine, upon formulating the distinction, to search for a nafkamina for the distinction. Nafkamina is the Talmudic phrase used in analytical debate. It is often used with the phrase, my nafkamina, what is the practical difference? An empirical case in which two understandings in fact lead to different results. Only when a nafkamina, even a rare and impractical one, is identified can one be sure that one's Brisker distinction is valid. Each distinction listed below has at least one nafkamina, even if not specified here. So you have a kefsa gavra, object person, which refers to distinctions made between a person and his or her actions, or the actions done upon him or her. For example, the Brisker Rub states that a forbidden incestuous relative is considered a forbidden person, while though a menstruating woman is not a forbidden person, the sexual act performed with her is forbidden. Kiyam Maisa, fulfillment action, refers to the distinction between, in the course of performing a biblical or rabbinic commandment, the physical performance act and the ultimate fulfillment of the commandment. Sima Sibba, effect cause. Does A cause B, or is A the result of the presence of B? For example, an adhesion on the lung makes a slaughter animal non-galak kosher, but the Shulchan Aruch and Ramah disagree as to whether it makes the animal non-kosher altogether. The disagreement appears to be based on the question, does the adhesion cause non-kosherness, or does it potentially result from non-kosherness, but also potentially results from a situation in which the animal remains kosher? The Shulchan Aruch holds the former, the Ramah holds the latter, in which case an animal with adhesions can be checked and subsequently found to be kosher. Active versus passive. There may be a distinction between a specified example in the law and a scenario where the law simply fails to obligate someone. Tzvei dinim. Always a favorite, the tzvei dinim, two laws. A Talmudic law can be shown to consist of two or more distinct components. Then one component can be shown not to apply to in a certain case, thus resolving a contradiction between the law rules in two situations. An example of this is Rav Chaim Brisker's interpretation that there is one law for a man to circumcise his son and another that obligates the son himself to be circumcised. In this case, after the son is circumcised, the obligation of circumcision present in both laws is fulfilled, although it is impossible for both laws to be fulfilled in their entirety. Is this principle stated here merely an application of a general rule, or is it a different and unique principle specialized to our context? This distinction is demonstrated in a story involving Rabbi Yitzchak Zeb Soloveitchik and witnessed by Rabbi Yecheskel of Rumsky. A person died following shortly thereafter by another wealthier person. The Jewish Burial Society, rather than follow the first-come, first-served policy mandated by law, buried the richer person first. A relative of the poor person came to demand an apology from the Burial Society. Rabbi Yitzchak Zeb Soloveitchik consulted the laws of mourning from the Rambam's Mishnah Torah for just a moment before telling the relative the Burial Society were wrong, but that is between them and God. I will inform them that their conduct was improper, but you are not involved here. After the fellow left, Rabbi Soloveitchik explained to his colleague, Rabbi Bromsky, that the question in hand was this. Certainly Judaism has a general principle of first come, first serve, because of the rule that when faced with the opportunity to do a mitzvah, one should not pass it up. If this is the only reason for the first come, first serve applies in the case of burials, then one violates it is no more wrong than one passes over any mitzvah opportunity, and his or her offense is between himself and God. Or instead, there may be a specialized notion of first come, first serve when it comes to burials to avoid offending the bereaved. Only according to the latter reasoning would an apology be required. Rabbi Soloveitchik found that Maimonides made no explicit mention of the first come, first serve in his laws of mourning, and thus extrapolated that only the generalized notion of first come, first serve applies to burial. Therefore, the bereaved could not demand an apology. Upon hearing this reasoning, Rabbi Bronsky claimed Rabbi Soloveitchik can deduce laws from the fact that Maimonides says nothing at all. So just continue here. The famed yeshiva of Volozhin argued, believe the first modern yeshiva favored a traditionalist approach toward Talmudics under the leadership of the Nitziv, who's Rev Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who I didn't have time to talk about, which often required absorbing a great amount of Talmudic material to acquire general Talmudic feel before analyzing a topic. Later, however, Rav Chaim Soloveitchik became a lecturer at Volozhin. At this point, around 1880, Rav Chaim's new methods first became public. However, as Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik suggested in his eulogy for the Brisker Rav, the full true Brisk approach as we know it today was not developed until Rav Chaim Soloveitchik had been Rabbi Brisk for many years. The notes of Rav Chaim Soloveitchik used for his lectures at Yeshiva of Volozhin are still extant today, and the approach found there is not as well developed as the later published works. The notes could best be described as a proto-Brisk lumdus, a term which could be used regarding the works of the Beis Halevi as well. Several modern scholars agree with this notion of proto-Brisk, and it can be heard in the lectures of Rabbi Dr. Aaron Rokefet Rotkov of Yeshiva University's history lectures. Nonetheless, as seen above, even proto-Brisk was already different enough and popular enough to cause significant tension at the Volozhin Yeshiva. An additional major influence of the Brisk approach was Reb Mendel Epstein of Slutsk. Reb Chaim Brisker Soloveitchik spent several early teenage years in Slutsk, where Reb Epstein served as his teacher. Rabbi Chaim later claimed that much of the Brisker derech attributed to him was founded on Rabbi Epstein's approach. However, as a small town's Malamed, Rabbi Epstein and his ideas never achieved fame. The Brisker method is a certain parallel of the Dor Revi of Rav Moshe Shmuel Glassner. Many scholars have been perplexed by the Rambam's ruling, as they've been used to understand the Talmud according to the Franco-German school of Rashi and the Tosfos, as opposed to the Babylonian Goanic school followed by the Rambam. Rabbi Glassner insisted that the Rambam interpretations follow perfectly from the Talmud. Once he interpreted his own laws, Rabbi Glassner's method coincided remarkably with those of Reb Chaim. Rabbi Glassner's methods caused a sensation in the Lithuanian yeshiva in the late 1920s and 30s, producing astonishment that a Hungarian rabbi had independently formalized a method so similar to Rav Chaim's. So, similar to what I was saying about the canonization process. So, whether Rabbi Chaim Soloveitchik came up with this method himself, or learned it from other people. He popularized it and created a whole bunch of students that created students of their own, and it's known as the Brisker method due towards him being the most formative teacher of it and the setting up of yeshivas from his students. Controversy. When it first appeared, some scholars denounced the Brisk approach as chemistry, as it sought to analyze each Talmudic law by breaking it down into components, whereas the traditionalist approach focused more on the entirety of the laws. While the Brisker method has won acceptance in almost all yeshivas today, it has its opponents. These include Rav Avram Yeshaya Korelitz, the Chazanich, who felt that often the existing approach to a Talmudic portion was sufficient. Additionally, the Brisker method is not widely used in modern yeshivas, which stem from the Mir Yeshiva, which instead tend to stress single unifying themes throughout Talmudic concepts, often focusing on only one Rishon if it is seen as the most truthful approach to a Talmudic passage. Yeshivas influenced by tells likewise adopt a broader approach. In Brisker Yeshiva, the tractate study deviate from the tractates popular in most yeshivas learn the Talmudic laws of money, property, marriage, and divorce. In Brisk, there is a greater tendency towards Kedoshim tractates as well as Nazar and Sota tractates and Nashim. Rabbi Joseph B. Salvechik is noted for a tendency to study the tractates of Sefer Moed, a tendency formalized by Yeshiva University decision to learn a tractate from Sefer Moed every 4 years. Reb Chaim was aware of the opposition to his method, but defended it in response to a rabbi who insisted on taking the words of the Gemara at face value. Reb Chaim replied, a term may refer to different laws in different contexts. For example, the Talmud requires panim chadoshos, meaning new presents, new faces at the wedding celebrations. A guest must be present who had not attended the wedding. Elsewhere, the Talmud comments that one sacrificial meat has been burned to ashes. The ashes no longer have a sacrificial status. As panim chadoshos abo lachan, a new presence has arrived, meaning that the ashes are not the same as the meat. So if you were at a Sheva Brachas party and you looked around and everyone there had already been at the couple's wedding, why not just take some meat and burn it to ashes? Challenge Rav Chaim. Clearly, the phrase panim chadoshos has different meanings in the context of wedding celebrations and sacrificial meat. Rav Chaim, who was opposed to overdoing the method, in response to a rabbi who claimed that Kedushin does not affect once for all time, but rather constantly renews itself every moment, Rav Chaim simply sarcastically replied, Mazel Tov, thereby indicating his view that such an approach was ridiculous. So let's finally look at Mir Yeshiva. Mir Yeshiva is the institute where Duvid studied in Jerusalem. And so I went over in detail the Brisker method because that's considered the most famous and advanced. But I said, Mahalik, all the various yeshivas and famous rabbis had different worldviews and methods. So Mir was founded in 1815, only 12 years after the Volozhin Yeshiva, and is one of the preeminent yeshivas. It was named after a town in Poland called Mir, and was a major rabbinic center of, came the rabbinic dynasty, Rav Elazar Yehuda Finkel, and the early Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel, and Duvid studied under his great-great-grandson Rav Nosson Tzvi Finkel of blessed memory, who passed away a decade ago. And the Mir Yeshiva, famously was part of exile to Japan and Shanghai, and Sagihara's saving by writing thousands of transit visas. And the Mir Yeshiva reestablished in New York City and Jerusalem. And Mir is many disciples. So Rabbi Bakst of Metro Detroit, of blessed memory, his children now run the yeshiva, studied in Mir in Poland, and escaped through Japan. And Mir Yeshiva in Israel is currently the largest yeshiva, and that's where Duvid went. Okay, so that concludes my section on the Yeshiva movement, which concludes my history section on Hasidim in general. And the Yeshiva system is extremely important to Haredi Judaism in general, and that all Haredi Judaism is directly connected to the Yeshiva movement. So I put the link in the chat if anyone wants to come on and chat a little bit. Yeah, as well, I was pretty impressed with those yeshiva ones. I mean, they're probably mostly written by yeshivish people. So I'm not sure that there's too many people outside of Orthodox Judaism that have studied that, or so I would guess that I haven't checked like the discussion section or the mods of the Wikipedia, but you look pretty good. I have some books on the subjects. I didn't do enough research to get good graphics, so I kind of wanted to cover it. I've been pushing it off. So I thought the Wikipedia was pretty good, so I just used that for today's. And like I said, from reading that, my guess would be almost all of the Wikipedia mods. If you're a Wikipedia mod, or you could check the discussion boards behind that. And I'm not sure, I doubt there's substantial debate among that. Okay, so let me just rest my voice, drink a little of my tea. I try to do a chant, and then I'm going to read my blog. So if Claire is in the chat, you could join a few minutes, and we'll talk about you going on Sula, the secular Israeli channel. It's somewhat unrelated to the topic at hand, but I was talking with Claire earlier, and Claire, I was able to hook up to be on Sula for this week, where she will be promoting her secular Quranism. And Claire has probably actually been on more Ask the Rabbis than anybody else. You can have a whole Ask the Rabbi dedicated to Claire. Otherwise, I will try to garner my voice if no one's popping in, or if there's no chats. I will. I mean, Don, I'm not a huge, I just use Wikipedia because it's the most easily accessible source available. Like, I have books on the subject, and I'm not sure, there might be, for the Hasidim stuff, I found better resources and slides and pictures. I kept on pushing this off and was involved in other research. So, I just did my best with the limited resources available. So I don't see any direct questions. So I'm going to read my essay on high and low birth, and about half of it is Judea related. And everyone who watches Duvid regularly knows with Duvid's use of the expression high and low birth, which largely comes from Hinduism and the Judaic concept. And I'll talk a little bit about Freemasonry and some of my future research. So I just put it together because I thought, this took a full 2 hours. I originally thought to do a full stream, and for whatever reason, I just didn't have it in me. This is the end of Shovavim, the first 6 parshas of the book of Exodus, which the Kabbalists say is the darkest time of judgment of the year in the Northern Hemisphere. Europe and America corresponds to the shortest days, the longest nights, the shortest days, and the coldest part of the winter. And in the yearly readings of Moses, the darkest time for the Jewish people in terms of the descendant into slavery in Egypt. So this week was Mishpatim, which, as I mentioned, has the hint towards reincarnation in it, but has the 10 commandments and the laws, and gives some sort of the darkest time of judgment of the year is over. This week will be Adar. the month, not Adar Weintraub from Sula, but Adar, the Hebrew month before Nisan, where Purim is in, and Adar is generally seen as a good sign, that the Jews defeated Haman, and the darkest period of time to leading up to Purim, where the Jews overcome our enemies, and generally, if you have a dispute or court case, it's recommended to try to have it settled in Adar, and so the darkest time, according to the Kabbalist, of the year is coming to a conclusion, and so hopefully it'll come to better things. There's famous songs, Misha Niknas Adar Marbe Mesimcha from the Gemara in Megillah. Misha, 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 Misha Niknas Adar. As the Adar comes in, it's a time of Simcha. Obviously, Purim is the time where Jews get drunk. And Vinahapaku, Adalo Yada, some good tunes. But on a more serious subject, because I'm going to talk about high and low birth, and some of these concepts, related concept, I've sung this song before. It's from the Gemara in Sukkah, and there's a lot of interesting Gemaras. The Gemara in Sukkah says that it talks about the end of days after Messiah comes, and God will slaughter the evil impulse, and the wicked will see that their evil impulse was just the size of a piece of rice, and the righteous will see that their evil impulse was the size of mountains. He was mentioning the Vilna Goan, and the Vilna Goan said, Massad's in the chat, so I guess even Massad, Duvid is can pop on the channel. Duvid is alumni of Mir Yeshiva in Jerusalem, the biggest yeshiva in Israel. In fact, the Israeli government paid for Duvid's education, even though Mir Yeshiva was neutral on the state of Israel. Like, Duvid studied under anti-Zionist rabbis, but Mir Yeshiva was neutral on Zionism. However, it was sponsored by the Israeli government. So when Duvid was in yeshiva in Israel, Mir Yeshiva is officially free, and the yeshiva is sponsored mostly by donations, but also by the Israeli government. So the Israeli government paid for Duvid's yeshiva education. And, God forbid, I remember, Massad would probably appreciate this story as a typical secular Israeli, that of the 4,000, students that were in Mir Yeshiva in the time, now it's like 6,000, there was a period of time where the Israeli government became suspicious that there were a lot of people enrolled in the yeshiva that weren't actually there. So the Israeli government officials set up a table requiring like a signature or sign-in of all of the students that were enrolled in yeshiva to clarify that the funds that they were receiving, or possibly people who are being deferred. Duvid was an American citizen, but even as an American citizen, the state government of Israel paid for my yeshiva education. But if you're Israeli, then you also have military deferment. So the Israeli government set up tables in the yeshiva requiring all the students to come by and sign and confirm that they're there, and that they're there for about a week. And after the week, there was still about, I don't know, it was a few hundred, maybe 500 students that never signed in, that were just enrolled in yeshiva but weren't there. And after a full week, were nowhere to be found to sign that they were actually there. And I'm not sure if they lost the funds, or maybe even some of them, if they were Israeli, faced repercussions from the state for being delinquent on their military service. But Duvid, even as an American citizen, the Israeli government still paid for my yeshiva education. And I was also an Or Samaic. I'm not sure if the Israeli government maybe also paid for. I was only an Or Samaic for like 3 months. I was in Mir Yeshiva for 2 years. Okay, so back to the Talmud. The Talmud in the Gemara in Sukkah says, at the end of the day, old men will sit around and they will say, praiseworthy is the man who never sinned. And those who sinned will say, return, repent. And it's an elu ve'elu, these and these, both those who never sinned and those who sinned. Yeah, so Oswald Nathan Kaufness was in Or Samak, actually the same yeshiva that Duvid was in. So Duvid, when I first went to Israel, started with a travel program and summer program, and then went back and spent a few months in Or Samak, which is a special yeshiva for Bali Tshuva American Jews that were not brought up Orthodox, and teach them to become Orthodox Jews. So Nathan Kaufness was actually also in Yeshiva Or Samak, or I believe Nathan Kaufness did not remain. He tried Orthodoxy for a brief period of time and then dumped it. And I think Luke Ford says that Nathan Kaufness even married a non-Jewish woman. But Nathan Kaufness did spend a period of time as an Orthodox Jew in the same yeshiva as Duvid. Although Duvid and Nathan Kaufness were not in the same school at the same time, Duvid and Nathan Kaufness did go to the same school. And Duvid was a diligent student, and after a few months transferred to a mainstream Orthodox yeshiva where the majority of the students were brought up Orthodox, and because Duvid was a diligent student. Okay, so Elu ve'elu oimrim ashrei mi shelo yachata. These and these will say, praiseworthy is the man that never sinned. Umi shechata, and he who sinned, yashuv, should return. So I will cover this concept in my essay. And so the Masad, the third person, it's actually common among rabbis. In fact, most rabbis are referred to by the book that they wrote. So I referred to the Soloveitchik. Some are referred to as their title, like the Rebbe, the Rabbi, the Rosh Yeshiva, and the ones that have books are referred to by their book. But it's actually Talmudic and Rabbinic to refer to yourself in the third person. It's more objective, meaning say there's I Duvid, and then there's the third person Duvid, and to say that the third person Duvid is more objective than the I Duvid. And in terms like the Musar movement and self-refinement, to say that I try to be objective about my own personal bias and refine my own bad behavior. Therefore, I refer to myself in the third person. And there's also a distance of who I really am. You're like, who are you? And like, I don't even know who I am. So you like, who is this Duvid guy? And so like, you're asking me, I don't know. Even though I'm Duvid, I don't know who I am. And so actually these concepts, like the third person is very common from different perspectives. Like Richard Nixon's probably the most famous American that was common to refer to himself. Like, you're not going to have you're not going to have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore, whatever his statements were. That, these days, most people, even Americans never even heard of Richard Nixon. But, historically in America, I think Richard Nixon was probably the most famous and Richard Nixon actually had a very high IQ. There's some levels within psychology, various reasons, but it actually originates from Judaism. And it's funny, when I was, I remember when I was in Israel and I first, went to meet big rabbis, and my friend gave me like a whole bunch of rules of like what you are and are not allowed to do. And, it's like, do not turn your back to the rabbi. Do not call the rabbi you. And like, I was, I was trying to, I was humble. I wanted to learn from the rabbis. I was taking my friend's advice, and I was like, tell me what to do. And he gave me the whole bunch of rules of like how you approach a rabbi. And like, said like, under no circumstance should you return your back to the rabbi. When you leave the room, you back up, walking backwards. You are not allowed to turn your back and walk away from the rabbi. Under no circumstance may you call the rabbi you. You refer to him as the rabbi. So it'd be like, okay, I would like to ask you, like you would say, I would like to ask the rabbi, even though the rabbi is the person you're speaking to. And I'm not even sure I understood it. Like, I just kind of like, okay, like I was trying to go to yeshiva. I wanted to know what to do. And I was just told, like, this is how you have to act. And I don't even know my friend knew the reason at the time. I think I asked him about, like, what the hell? And like, I mean, the showing your back, I intrinsically understood, like, that makes sense. Even like in Hinduism for the deities, that's somewhat like universal, possibly in the army also. I'm not sure if in the army you had such a thing, like your commander, if, or like the at ease, like you're not allowed to show your back to the rabbi, but it was considered disrespectful to, like after you're done speaking to the rabbi, the Rabbi, you're not supposed to just like turn around and walk away. You're supposed to walk backwards till you reach the door, and it's considered a disrespect to turn your back to the rabbi. And I'm not, like you could give variants of the reason, and say like your full attention, and that also applies like within Freemasonry and army, various situations like possibly employment and the boss, Hinduism, Chinese culture of it being disrespectful to give your back to somebody, but also to call somebody you is considered disrespectful. So when you speak to the rabbi, you're not allowed to say you, like can you, will you. You say can the rabbi, will the rabbi. And the rabbis generally speak about themselves in the third person. And it was considered like there's different explanations of why, it's like laughing, like why laughing is considered bad behavior or a sign of bad character, and referring to yourself as I, in some respect, was considered like I don't call it blasphemous, but it was saying it was a sign of character refinement, that you don't refer to yourself as an I, you refer to yourself in the third person, and so there's different level, and I said most likely related to objectivity and character refinement in term, and the the Kutzker Rebbe has an expression, like there's a lot of expressions, uh, like if I am I because you are you, and you are you because I am I, then you are not you and I am not I. And there's a lot of Hasidic things about like who is the I. So in Yiddish it's like wer bist du? Who are you? It's like, well, I'm David Kelton. I'm Duvid. I'm an engineer. I'm a Jew. No, who are you? Who are you? It's like, no, that's not who you are. And so it's like a deep Hasidic philosophical thing where like, who are you? No, that's not who you are. That's not who you really are. Who are you really? So from that respect, it's actually my Hasidic training that I refer to myself in the third person, but I said it has parallels within Freemasonry, within some criminal behavior. So there's also distancing a person from their crimes. So maybe a lot of people look at like Richard Nixon as a negative. Richard Nixon spoke about himself in the third person, and that was negative, and he was disassociating himself from his crimes. Like God forbid a person who committed horrible crimes and doesn't remember that they're the ones who did it. And so, like, no, it wasn't me. You're like, I didn't do it. I don't remember doing it. Oh, like maybe Duvid did it, but it wasn't me. And I think that's it's a famous joke in identity for like the defense for a crime, saying like, okay, the witnesses, they saw my body do it, but it wasn't me. I didn't do it. So there's also within character refinement, disassociation from the body and sinful activity. Like, okay, this body's done a lot of bad things. I have done, but I'm not the person who did those bad things, even though like clearly I was the person who did those bad things. So, it's interesting that you asked that. It's actually very connected to yeshiva and yeshiva protocol. And it's kind of like Protestants in America, like where like Catholic priest or something like that, like I will actively not give any special respect to like a person just because they're wearing a priestly uniform. So Israelis are like that with rabbis. That like, like if you're in the rabbinic training, like like when I was in yeshiva, everybody stood when the rabbi came in, like for class every day. And like every time the rabbi came in, all the students stand, and you're not supposed to sit down until the rabbi sits down. So like when the rabbi enters the room, everybody stands, and then you stand until the rabbi sits down, and then you could sit down. And like I said, not giving your back to the rabbi, not calling the rabbi you. And there's hundreds of rules of just these like protocol of what it means to respect the rabbi. And for most Israelis, it's active like no way will I give any super respect to the rabbi. I don't even like those guys, let alone think they deserve respect. And there's a lot of parallels in American society to especially the priesthood, like Catholics. Hindus are also like that. Like also a lot of Hindus just sing the yarmulke. It's like a 50-50 thing where a lot of people will respect you just for the religious garb. And like I remember like mafia guys like in New York had building permits and clubs and God forbid even like cocaine. And like some Italians, some African Americans, but mostly Italians are trained to respect religious people. I remember one mafia type guy saying is like, I have never disrespected one of you people, even obviously clearly messed up one like you. And it was just like, you could tell like, okay, I was a cocaine addict. I was at like clubs and I like relatively, I wasn't doing that bad, but he was like, you are clearly messed up. But he made the point is, I have never disrespected a person wearing one of these in my life, even a clearly messed up one like you. And Sephardim could be like that also. Like in Israel, like secular Jews like will actively disrespect Orthodox Jews. But a lot of Sephardim, even like Israeli army people are like that too, where like they just have a training like, you have one of these on your head, I'm going to treat you with respect, even though you're clearly messed up. And it's like the 50-50 rule where sometimes it works for you, sometimes it works against you. Sometimes you're like, well, I have no idea who you are, whether you're a good Jew or a bad Jew, but you got one of these on, I'm going to show you respect. And then there's other people who are like, I don't know who you are, what you've done. You got one of these on, I'm going to disrespect you. And it's variant by culture. So like Italians are high religious authority people a lot of times. And, like they see you in religious garb, are going to treat you more respectfully, even if you're messed up. And a lot of Hindus are like that also. Like you say, like you must respect people of like the religious caste of the religious order, even if they're messed up, even if they're clearly behaving badly, not in line with proper religious behavior. In Israel, as I said, like some Sephardim have like the Italian type natural respect of people simply because they're dressed religious. And although your average, Ashkenazi Israeli, secular Israeli is the opposite. Like even in Israel, like there were cases like some guy in Tel Aviv just like randomly hitting a Lubavitcher. And I think they even like caught him, got arrested. He's like, why he did it? Because like, I don't like those guys. And, so like, there's the ratio, the 80-20 rule, but generally these things are like the 50-50 rule. It works for you half the time, it works against you half the time. Where, if you go to an engineering conference, if you go to a club, like being Jewish in general. So not just like wearing a yarmulke, being Jewish in general is, philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism. Half the time it works for you and your benefit. Half the time it works, to various degrees, it works against you. Being an Orthodox Jew among Jews at large, half the time it works for you, half the time it works against you. Although, it varies in various cultures too. So among secular Jews, being an Orthodox Jew maybe more often works against you than for you. But, there'll always be people who will naturally be deferent and respectful to you just because you're wearing a yarmulke. Okay, so this is going to come up in my essay. Elu ve'elu oimrim ashri mi shelo yichatu, in terms of the high and low birth. I'm going to cover this. I'm just going to read my essay. So This song actually, the words come from the Gemara and Sukkah, and the tune is said to come from the Baal Shem Tov. Elu v'elu oimrim, Ashrei mi shelo yichata, Ashrei mi shelo yichata, umi shechata yashu yashu. And just because I was talking about the yeshiva, there's one tune, as in like Hasidim are very into chanting and singing. Yeshiva, compared to secular society, because Friday night prayers, they're still always sing much less often. But there's one song that's actually attributed to Rav Chaim Volozhin, and the words, ironically, come from the Zohar. And Chad Yasmin, the words are in Aramaic. I've sang this before on Ask the Rabbis. Personally, I like the tune Chad Yasmin, like the Almighty Chad Yasmin v'yaskin v'simchas Torah Kid shabrichu oimrim. I'm forgetting the words, but it's a tune that's attributed to the Chaim Volozhin. It's a popular tune. I have to look it up. Ironically, Hatikva is a Chabad tune. No, and it's not a Chabad tune. Hatikva actually comes from like a secular European tune. It's the most popular Jewish song in America. They play at baseball games. What's it slip? It's just slipping me, but yeah, Hatikva is a nice song. Young Israel, modern Orthodox events, like they sing it often. So like the local Zionist yeshiva, they like open up with Hatikva. It's a nice song. Most yeshivas, Chabad, they don't sing Hatikva. Like even in Israel, the Knesset, the Haredi members of Knesset refuse to stand for Hatikva. It's considered, I don't consider heretical, but even in the Knesset itself, like now the current members of the ruling coalition from Shas and United Torah Judaism refuse to like stand for Hatikva. I don't know if they don't stand for it. They definitely don't sing it. I think they don't even stand for it. And but it's a nice song. I'm not so nationalist. Like I'm more. I went to yeshiva. I was neutral on Zionism, and generally my opinions are in opposition to most Jews. So I steer clear. Like if people ask me, I'll tell you my views on Israel and like one state solution, equal citizenship for all. But I'm not an Israeli citizenship, and don't push my opinions on Israeli politics. I'm neutral on most of the issues. Like I don't know if I'd be Haredi, like United Torah. I follow Israeli politics. And like Likud, and I actually met, like I remember I've shaken hands with Aryeh Deri before. I remember when I first came to Brooklyn and I spent a summer in the Catskills, a Shabbos at this wealthy camp in the Catskills, and Aryeh Deri was there for Sabbath. And Friday night, I don't think there was a big rabbi, but Friday night after services, people lined up to shake hands with Aryeh Deri. And Duvid waited in line to shake hands with Aryeh Deri. But Israeli politics are complicated, and I would fall more on the religious spectrum than political. I used to be active in opposition to mandatory military service. Like I give up. I used to like post on Facebook and talk about opposition to mandatory military service. That was like the one issue I actively spoke up on. Like in America, I'm very liberal. I'm very friendly with Palestinians. Like I met Rashida Tlaib. I like her, but I'm not involved in the Israeli politics. Like I'm not part of BDS, God forbid, or anything. But I make a point to be friendly to Palestinians whenever I meet them and sympathetic to their cause, but I'm not involved in any of the actual political activity besides being sympathetic and friendly towards Palestinians. Typically I'm defensive of Rashida Tlaib, but I'm not involved in any of those political causes. My leanings are conservative, and I don't think I would be involved in politics in Israel. Like, unfortunately, the biggest consensus issue in all of Israel is mandatory military service, and I think that's a big problem. I think it's probably one of the biggest mistakes. Politically, almost all my positions on Israeli politics are unpopular. I saw Benny Morris. I have Benny Morris's book on Israeli wars, and Benny Morris was like interviewed by African American Coleman or something this week, and he actually said it too. And I've been saying I think Israel should end the right of return in terms all of my political positions are extremely unpopular. Like less than 10% of Israelis and even Jews in general agree. Like Duvid supports a one-state solution. Duvid thinks Israel should end the right of return for American Jews. I support universal humanism, democratic government that has equal citizens for Jews and Israelis. Religiously, I would believe in the third temple, maybe reestablishment of the kingdom of David. But I'm really not that political. So even American politics, I don't vote. I have commentary. You've asked me my opinion on politics. I have opinions on issues, but I don't have opinions on politics in that sense. So issue by issue, I will have opinions. And almost all of my opinions on Israel are universally unpopular among Jews. And I've analyzed, God forbid I was mentioning the shootings, anti-Semitism, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and all the experts say it's going to get worse. If you look, there's basically in gun violence in America, anti-Semitism in America, even inflation, economic things. In terms of Israel, in terms of the violence, the situation, all the experts say it's going to get worse. And so, I saw Benny Morris. Someone asked, this African American who was interviewing him, you asked him if it's 2100 and there was peace in Israel, what would have been the path that happened to created that peace? And so, as a chess player, just analyzing scenarios, it's tough to see. It's tough to see what could help the situation. You really need a miracle. You need some sort of greater paradigm shift, mass enlightenment, change in the masses. And the more you know about what's going on, the more negative the outlook looks. Like you said, oh man, we're just going to end up killing each other. Or the war. And you can analyze from a military perspective in terms of group conflict and saying so the analysis of what's happening in Israel is Israel looks like it might improve its regional situation with Arab partners in the region, but the situation with the Palestinians is going to get worse. So Israel maybe will be able to make further advancements with the regional Arab partners. However, the situation of the Palestinians will likely get worse, and it means that there's going to be continuing terrorism, continuing violence. I saw the last, this year, there's already been 11 Israelis killed in terrorism, and every expert says it's going to get worse. There's not a single expert on, from a secular Israeli perspective that's saying that there's some path towards it getting better. They're all saying it's going to get worse. And so you say okay, well, idealistically, maybe there could be a one-state solution and everyone could live, in peace together as brothers, in a messianic vision, and said, well, I support that. But practical, it's tough to know. And the more you analyze it, the more negative it looks. Just like anti-Semitism in America. And, just because Massad's in the chat, I was on Sula, and I was saying counter-Semitism, not anti-Semitism. Fighting anti-Semitism escalates it. And even like Palestinians, a lot of stuff escalation. So like, God forbid, this guy, Justin Tran, who shot up, the people outside of the synagogue. I was saying like Handsome Truth, like Duvid talked with Handsome Truth. Handsome Truth was a Bernie bro. Like literally 2016, Handsome Truth, the worst anti-Semite in America today, was a Bernie bro. And even when I spoke to him, like he was warning me, he spoke to me and he warned me. He's like, you guys got to stop it or it's going to be bad for you. And he yelled at me and he warned me, like you guys have a chance to stop your bad behavior now. And if you do, God forbid. But I'm thinking of this guy who got expelled from dental school for, like, the story hasn't came out completely, but it appears that this guy got expelled for dental school for anti-Semitism. And like, God forbid, I'm not defending his crime in any way. I'm just explaining his crime, like the motivation factor in the terms of somewhat anti-Semitism being caused by Jewish behavior, escalated by Jewish behavior. Not to, God forbid, defend his crime shooting people, but just saying, let's say he was an anti-Semite and he got kicked out of dental school. And then he was homeless and he was living in his car and he decided to shoot some Jews, God forbid. And, to some extent, not saying that we caused, like we deserved it, God forbid, as Jews, we didn't deserve, like these were innocent Jews that didn't have anything relatively, but it was escalated by fighting anti-Semitism. It was like, oh, this guy's an anti-Semite. He's spreading anti-Semitism. Therefore, we have to get him kicked out of dental school. And then like a few years later, he's shooting Jews, God forbid. And, it's somewhat like I was saying, like, I saw Ben Shapiro debated Yair Rosenberg at Boca Raton. Rabbi Ephraim Goldberg hosted a debate last week, and Ephraim Goldberg was making the point, like, the point that Duvid, I almost thought like maybe he watched Duvid on Sula or something like that, or something, because he sounded like he was quoting me. But like, if you label people anti-Semites, they become anti-Semites. And, saying to Luke Ford, like, according to the new AJC survey now in America over the last 5 years, there's twice as many anti-Semites as there were 5 years ago. And is it just that we're labeling twice as many people anti-Semites? Or did we do something wrong? Or does something shift? And, it's tough. And I'm going to read this essay and you're going to see what the Talmud says. Because, like, God forbid, most Israelis, they don't even know what the rabbis say. Like, I'm listening to these guys, like on Sula, like in the chat, they're all bashing Duvid. I'm like, what the hell? This is what the rabbis say. This is what the official rabbis in the coalition and the Israeli government says. Duvid's an Uncle Tom and like a self-hating Jew because I'm saying what the rabbis in power in Israel, in the ruling coalition in Netanyahu's government say. But the Israelis, they don't even know this stuff. Like, they have no idea what these rabbis say. And, that's just the nature of the situation. Why, it's kind of like I say on Ralph, it's a zero-sum battle. Like, the nature of, like, at least say the counter-Semites, the whites, the European, the anti-immigration, the people who support multiculturalism and immigration, that's a zero-sum battle. There's not really a compromise. Either we're going to continue immigration and America will move more into a multicultural society, or like in England, or there's going to be an end to immigration and more things to protect the European character of America. It's very unlikely to see any scenario where it's both ways. And this is like in Israel, one-state solution, everyone equal citizens, or it moves more and more to being a Jewish state and pushing the Arabs out to expulsion, or different levels of tiered citizenship. You would call it apartheid, occupation, and also between Haredim and Israelis, that Israel moves towards more a religious state under the authority of the Haredi rabbis, or it moves towards a secular state, and it's basically zero sum. It's very hard to see some form of compromise. And at this point, Israelis, for a period, the Haredim have really been winning for decades. Like even with the coalition with Naftali Bennett, they had to put Naftali Bennett as prime minister to get the Haredim out of the government. But Naftali Bennett, he's not Haredi, but he was Orthodox in some sense. And like Yair Lapid didn't even become prime minister till after the coalition fell apart. So you couldn't really get the religious out of power in Israel. Now the Orthodox have more power than before the whole fiasco. That in terms of the Netanyahu coalition, they forced out the secular Russians, and now it's just Netanyahu and religious factions, and the Kahanists are in power, and it's zero sum. And to say like that's the nature of a lot of these cultural battles is there's really no compromise. You could have like regional, like abortion or something. You could have state rights. You could get zero sum. It's either going to be allowed or disallowed, or you could have regional compromise where it returns to the state. And some states have different takes on abortion. You could have some sort of compromise in like Israel between Haredim and secular and Palestinians, where some form of like Mossad's guy, the professor, the name slipping, the Arab expert, the Ashkenazi Jew, speaks Arabic, and is the expert with the emirate solution, that Israeli would have some sort of like a break into emirates and have like a one-state solution, going back to like the Indian solution from like 1947, that you would have one state that would include Israel and Palestinians, but would be divided into emirates, like regional states that would have various levels of control. And that might also be for like Haredim and secular, which would be most likely the best form of a solution. I actually agree with Mossad and his guest, I'm sorry, the name's slipping me, of the professor that's favors the emirate solution for Israel. In America also, I think that's probably the best solution, where you're going to have some form of balkanization or return to state laws and emirates. And we're going forever on rambling on Israeli politics. Dude is really not that political. So let me read my new essay, and I'm going to go over it also tomorrow on Week in Review. And I'm pretty happy with this one. So anyone who's been following Duvid, last Week in Review, was like hours of debate on the topic, and the expression high and low birth, and what does it mean? So I go into detail. Most of this is from a rabbinic point of view. So I'm going to publish this on my blog. I didn't have a chance to review it that much. I'll go over a Week in Review. I'll probably show it to my mom and let her proofread it for me. Hey, Joseph, thanks for showing up. Messiah will be a unifier. So I don't think Messiah will be Litvish or Hasidic. Like Messiah, Messiah has to come from, he has to be a person that comes from some lineage, but Messiah will have to be some form of unifier. Say, like, if the Lubavitch Rebbe was the most likely Messianic candidate of last generation, okay, he was Hasidic, he was a blue-eyed man, he was Ashkenazi, but he was somewhat of a unifying figure. So, even more so from the Lubavitch Rebbe, it's unclear, to say that how Messiah has to unify all the Jews. So, I spoke at length that most of the Jews are Ashkenazic, although those demographics are changing. So we say, like, well, if 75% of worldwide Jewry are Ashkenazic, then maybe, okay, Messiah might be Ashkenazic, but these figures are changing now. But clearly Messiah has to unify the whole world. So, I don't think Messiah will fall into a sectarian role like that. Okay, so let me read this essay. So you could do any at Duvids. This might take a good 15, 30 minutes for me to read through it. And hopefully it'll be thought-provoking, and I'll cover it more tomorrow. Lineage, high and low birth, and the problem of evil. For years of streams and debates, I've probably generated the most controversy from usage of the terminology high and low birth. Sometimes I use the term while doing public psychoanalysis, dissecting people's motivation behind their behavior, often purposely to evoke a strong reaction. A common explanation to our behavioral patterns is the circumstances of a person's birth, sometimes connecting people's unrefined behavior and lack of higher purpose to having taken low birth, and the opposite side diminishing the accomplishments of others due to the benefits they had from birth. For example, in relation to current events, noting relatively President Biden took low birth and Donald Trump took high birth, significant to their differences in motives, personality, style, and significance of their respective accomplishments. Recently, in discussions on the canonization of science and the Royal Society, the topic has come up constantly in relation to the effects of elites on larger society and how somebody becomes elite and the role of a person's birth status plays in their biography and accomplishments. Much of the adverse reaction is in connecting a person's relative birth status to their self-worth or as good-bad judgment. My co-host on Sundays Night's Week in Review, Jennifer, also known as Church of Entropy, regularly takes issue with my terminology, sometimes even winning over the audience. Jennifer claims the terminology high and low birth is unnecessarily insulting, ill-defined, and weakly connected to people's behaviors, motivation, and accomplishments. Last episode, I was arguing that the terminology high and low birth is not what is triggering, but the phenomenon itself, as the concept is essentially related to the problem of evil. What bothers people is that it can appear that some people have easier or more difficult lives, or that the ability to accomplish one's desire is determined by their position of birth. This is especially difficult in modern liberal societies that espouse meritocracy and that anyone can achieve anything they put their mind to and efforts to. The belief in equality belies many self-evident facts like wealth and outcome disparity based on birth. Therefore, I'm writing this essay to explain what I mean by high and low birth, the origin of the concept, the relationship of position of birth to meritocracy, nature versus nurture, expertise, reincarnation, and the problem of evil. I will also explain why a person's position of birth is essential to self-actualization and understanding power dynamics, including the progression of ideas throughout history. I borrow the terminology of high and low birth from Hinduism with connotations to the caste system. However, all cultures and societies have a similar concept. Difference of birth are obvious. These differences affect power structures, wealth imbalance, social stratification, and mobility. The position of birth is not limited to genetic factors, but also nurture and societal factors. In fact, the majority of the relevance to the position of birth is nurture factors, not genetic factors, as even people born with natural talent might not have the advantages of nurture and resources, or people born with limited natural talent might benefit substantially from nurture and resources. Generally, the nurture factors can be generalized into essential resources put into developing the talent and potential of the youth, as well as setting them on the right path, teaching them the difference between right and wrong in general education. Taking high birth means having these resources abundantly available, and low birth a lack of these needed resources. The concepts here are extensive and have many branches of modern scholarship in politics, education, psychology, economics, expertise, and more, which I hope to return to in future essays. Historically, the concept of high and low birth is more part of religion, and the meaning has substantially changed in our postmodern world. I briefly go over the Hindu conception and biblical conception. As mentioned, I borrow the terminology of high and low birth from the non-scholarly expression of American Hindus. The concept is part of the caste system, which remains a controversial topic of considerable debate among Vedic scholars. The general concept of high and low birth derives from a belief in reincarnation and transmigration of souls, where the essential non-physical essence soul of a person survives death and is reincarnated to a new creation. The terminology high and low refers to whether the person's soul ascends or descends based on their past karma. Souls can transmigrate in the same bloodline and family, relative equal birth position, or into different bloodlines or even other species. So a person who has bad karma is punished by being reincarnated as an animal insect and can be considered taking lower birth, or one who does almost everything right and lives a righteous life, has good karma, will be reincarnated in noble bloodline, or as a Brahmin, considered taking higher birth. In many sects of Hinduism, reincarnation and the caste system are intricately connected. The caste system is generally understood as a form of social stratification perpetuated by endogamy and hereditary transmission of lifestyle, occupation, ritual status, social interaction, and understanding of purity. Most Hindus believe in Sanatana Dharma, or an absolute set of duties or religiously ordained practices incumbent upon all Hindus, regardless of class, caste, or sect. However, Vedic scholars disagree about the role of birth and the ability of people to change roles in relationship to Sanatana Dharma. Vedic scholars who reject caste in entirety and that anyone can meritocratically fulfill any station in life still recognize that parents train their children to fulfill their relative station in life or higher. So even though someone from lowest birth can reach the highest stations in life, being born to parents of higher position makes that attainment more accessible. As sometimes a person, regardless of birth position, rises to king, the king's son is still by far the most likely next king. The full role of reincarnation and caste within Hinduism is beyond the scope of this essay and my scholarship, but to suffice it to say the terminology high and low birth comes from colloquial Hindu expressions in English to explain these concepts. My usage of the terminology high and low birth is generalized and incorporates multiple concepts. However, I have not found a better way to express the concept. The biblical and rabbinical conception usually does not use the terminology of high and low birth and is less connected to reincarnation and more direct concept of reward and punishment and a person's progeny being directly rewarded and punished for one's deeds. In many aspects, Judaism's central tenet involves the concept of high birth as a chosen people who with benefits accrued purely by birth status. Biblically, wealth and status are postulated to be directly related to obedience to the law and is transferred from parents to children, while in later rabbinic literature, birth status is more in relationship to knowledge of the law and purity of living life free of sin. Although you will not find the terminology high and low birth in Judaism because it's more in line to Hindu conceptions of reincarnation and transmigration of souls. The Bible makes very clear the nature of reward and punishment, that children are rewarded and punished for their parents' behavior. Abraham is notified by God that his behavior will have direct implications on the lives of his descendants, including the punishment of slavery in Egypt. The book of Genesis is full of prophecy of future generations of both rewards and punishments for these deeds and mistakes of the forefathers. The third commandment clearly states in Exodus 24-6, "You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I am the Lord your God. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of their parents to a third and fourth generations for those who hate me, but showing loving faithfulness to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments." The wording of most of the prophecies concerning the Jewish people is not in terms of the merit of the current generations of the Jewish people, but as fulfillment to a commitment God made to our forefathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The 13 attributes of mercy at the center of the High Holiday Prayer Service include the reward to future generations for the parents' behavior. Exodus 34:6, maintaining loving devotion to 1,000 generations, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin. The next verse, not quoted in the prayers, mirrors the opposite, yet will by no means leave the guilty unpunished, will visit the iniquity of the fathers to their grandchildren to the third and fourth generation. The biblical conception of reward and punishment is more directly related to suffering in terms of wealth, health, peace, and prosperity. Although the Bible makes clear that in most cases, people are not directly punished for their parents' behavior or vice versa, besides inheriting debt and some level of parental responsibility, a person's position in life can directly be correlated to the deeds of their parents. If one has good things in life, wealth, health, successful family, peace, and prosperity, it is in large part the reward of the person's ancestors' behavior and vice versa. Unlike in Hinduism, where the person's status is more attributed to their previous karma of past lifetimes and hence the expression high or low birth, in the Bible, the child's birth position is seen not in terms of our own behavior, but the behavior of our parents. Parents who follow the law are rewarded with children who avoid suffering, and parents who sin are punished with children who suffer. God commands the Jewish people to obey the law and promises reward and punishment based on the faithfulness not only to the individual but their progeny. Talmudic literature relates the reward and punishment of children for the deeds of our ancestors is the question of evil. Many scholars relate this to the rise of Rabbinic Judaism after the destruction of the Second Temple. In biblical theory, God runs the world in a transparent way, and the righteous are rewarded and the wicked are punished, implying a direct correlation between righteous behavior and wealth, societal status, health, peace, and prosperity. As in the book of Job, one who is suffering can be safely assumed to be being punished for sinful behavior. God is just, and by direct implication, one being rewarded is righteous and one being punished is wicked. Any other standing is blasphemy, contradicting the benevolent and just nature of our Creator. The Talmud postulates that there was a dispensational change in the world after the destruction of the Holy Temple, whereas before there was a direct correlation between a person's material prosperity and their righteousness and suffering in one's wickedness. After the destruction of the temple, reward and punishment was no longer completely transparent, and the question of evil enters rabbinic literature, usually in the form of why the wicked prosper and the righteous suffer. In Jewish theology, generally suffering is caused by one's own sinful behavior. Suffering cleanses a person's transgression. Brachos Brachos 5a, and there's no suffering without iniquity. Shabbos 55a, but not all suffering can be directly attributed to one's personal shortcomings, although the Talmud makes clear that the vast majority of suffering is directly related to one's personal transgression. The Talmud proposes multiple other possibilities for the cause of suffering other than one's own personal failings. The Talmud Shabbos 33b postulates the righteous suffer for the sins of the generation, and if there are no righteous of the generation, innocent children suffer for the generation. I sometimes refer to this as the Jesus principle, where the righteous voluntarily take upon themselves to suffer on behalf of the sins of the masses at large, as so the masses do not have to suffer the full consequences of our actions. This highest level of righteousness, accepting the sufferings of others upon ourselves, even martyrdom, is related to high levels of faith. But the Talmud takes this one step further to explain why innocent children might suffer in some form of collective punishment to avoid the natural catastrophic consequences of our own behavior, with the suffering being transferred to innocent children. God forbid, this is extremely difficult theology and controversial even among the rabbis, including understanding the essential role of the Jewish people playing God's plan for the world and all of creation. The Talmud directly relates the transfer of reward and punishment from parents to children to the question of evil. The Talmud relates Brachos 7a that Moses asked God directly why sometimes it appears the righteous suffer and the wicked prosper. To which Moses is explained that when the righteous suffer, it is due to being punished for the sins of their parents, and when the wicked are rewarded, it is due to being rewarded for the good deeds of their parents. These issues are extensively discussed in the Talmud and the rabbinic commentaries. Other explanations include reincarnation and reward and punishment in the world to come, heaven or hell. A righteous person might be punished for the few sins they have, making it appear they are unjustly suffering, but this is just in worldly appearance, as the righteous is having their few sins atoned for through suffering, so they can attain full reward in the next world. Wicked people may appear to prosper in this world, but may be getting the reward for a few good deeds they or their parents have, in order that they can be fully punished after death. I hope in future essays to return to Jewish theology, but now just give an overview in relationship to understanding high and low birth and how Judaism historically explained iniquities bestowed upon people at birth. One interesting idea in the Talmud worth noting is the dichotomy between the perfectly righteous, one who never sinned, and the newly repentant former sinner. The Talmud proposes an interesting principle, Brachos 33b, a righteous person can not occupy the place the penitent stands. Later rabbinic commentators elaborate on this principle. The well-renowned treatise Gates of Repentance and Duties of the Heart delineate various problems and benefits the newly repentant and perfectly righteous have over each other. However, both conclude better to have never sinned. The Tanya of the first Chabad Rebbe, based on the Rizal's Kabbalah, extensively details the process and benefits of the newly repentant, and the current Chabad Lubavitch worldwide outreach movement is partially based on this principle. In terms of high and low birth, generally only someone who took high birth has the potential to be perfectly righteous. as living life without sin is nearly impossible, and only one trained from birth in the right path and law has the potential. In the Hasidic and Yeshiva world, this justified the establishment of rabbinic family dynasties. Rabbinic law introduces the term kidnapped at birth, Tinik Shel Nishba, Shavuos 5a, specifically referring to a child that was literally kidnapped at birth and raised by robbers, then makes their way back to the community. The term later became a blanket term for Jews that were not raised within the tradition, without knowledge of the law, and hence not bearing full responsibility for keeping the law. Regardless of reward and punishment based off responsibility and knowledge of the law, one who was not born knowledgeable of the law cannot be perfectly righteous and free of sin, as ignorance of the law only limits the culpability for the sin, not the sin itself. High birth can be understood as being brought up in a righteous family that trained their children properly from an early age and protected them from sin. So as the child grew up, they knew right from wrong and were able to fully avoid sinful behavior. One taking low birth is not educated in the law and does not know the difference from right and wrong and naturally falls into sinful behavior. Although one can later repent, learn the law, and become obedient to the law, they will nonetheless commit sinful activity that cannot be erased in the process and hence cannot be considered fully righteous. However, as implied in the Talmud, the newly repentant has certain advantages despite their prior sins over the perfect righteous person free of sin, and can fulfill a special purpose in God's master plan that the perfectly righteous cannot fulfill. As mentioned, this principle is at the center of the Chabad Lubavitch World Outreach Movement, and a topic I hope to return to in future essays. This rabbinic conception of high and low birth has direct parallels to the Vedic philosophy, and many Kabbalists also explain the phenomenon in terms of reincarnation, which unfortunately is well beyond the scope of this essay. Anyone following my regular content is already familiar with my multiple truth hypothesis. When I use the expression high or in low birth, I am combining different ideas from different fields, even conflicting, to express an important general idea. Much of the background of the concept derives from Hinduism and Judaism. However, I loosely use the terminology in secular terms. Most recently, the concept of high and low birth comes up in my current research on the canonization of math and science, specifically the Royal Society of Science. This is loosely related to the biblical and Vedic concept, but in many ways different, arising in Christian Europe among Freemasonic bodies, specifically the Royal Society of Science. Speaking of the founders of modern science, their biographies and status of birth is important to understanding the canonization of science. Many educated people would be familiar with famous names such as Newton, Leibniz, Euler, Gauss, Helmholtz, Maxwell, Riemann, Lagrange, Bayes, and many others, including details of their personal biography, even their parents' biography. One of the main reasons these great scientists were able to change the world was that they dedicated most of their life and effort towards math and science with the support of the elites of their generation. All these men were Freemasons and members of various Royal Societies of Science modeled after the Royal Society of London. As can be inferred from the name Royal Society, the society consisted mostly of nobility, people who took high birth, royalty, landowners, men of means, who were able to appropriate funds to the study of science. Many of these well-known scientists took relatively lower birth and struggled for years to earn admittance to the Royal Society, and then had to apprentice and work in labs of others for years before they obtained the resources to further their own research, many later acquiring titles of nobility for themselves. Common task for aspiring scientists is teaching the youth of the elite and solving problems that benefit the crown and aristocracy. This system largely remains in place today within the university system, and the Royal Society of London is still from the most prestigious clubs of scientists. In future essays, I plan to go into extensive details into the canonization of science in relationship to my multiple truth hypothesis. My pontification on the subject was the catalyst for this essay, explaining what I mean by high and low birth and why the history of science cannot be separated from the concept of high and low birth. In modern times, high and low birth can still be understood in the classical terms, but is mostly important to education and economics in relation to wealth and outcome inequality. Most current research is in terms of social economical status, a relatively new idea. Although we live in a free society without titles or inherited positions, the value of taking high birth or challenge of low birth is still clear. Despite humble beginnings, Joe Biden rose to become president of the United States, but generally one's social economic status is most strongly correlated to the status of one's parents. Even people of immense natural ability may lack resources and struggle with challenges that prevent them from fulfilling their talents, and others born with every advantage may coast to positions of wealth, power, and prestige with minimal resistance. Many of the largest debates in modern society have the status of birth at the center, including within psychology, medicine, sociology, economics, politics, and more. Some of the biggest challenges of society today also has birth inequalities at the center, such as health outcome disparities, crime, taxes, all beyond the scope of this essay, but hope to return to in future, and why I wanted to introduce and explain the concept. In conclusion, even though high and low birth is ill-defined, riddled with contradictions, and triggering just at mention, the concept is needed to understand history and advanced society. One of the most mentioned commandments in the Bible is to look after the orphan, as one without a father needs to be taught the difference between right and wrong and the ways of the world. An important note is high and low birth does not mean good or bad, nor is recognizing birth status intrinsically against concepts of meritocracy and equal rights, or even desires for more equal outcomes. On the contrary, properly understanding high and low birth is necessary to overcome it. High and low is not meant to convey a moral judgment and is somewhat objective in terms of various benefits and challenges of station of birth can be quantified and ranked, such as social economic background, which can easily be quantified and ranked, as well as attached benefits and challenges to the inherited status. Also, equality of the law and divine judgment before God can be separated from birth position. I largely wrote this essay to explain to regular viewers a week in review of Church of Entropy what I mean by the terminology and why I keep using it despite heavy pushback. Hope this essay opens up much important conversation and is the start of diving deeper into many related concepts and to clearly define this issue when status of birth comes up in other topics. Okay, so there you go. Kind of big print, about 3,500 words, 10 pages here in the big print. And so if people are, my week in review viewers, they have probably heard this before, and I've never fully explained high and low birth. It's somewhat self-evident, and it's contradictory because, as I mentioned, the terminology high and low birth derives from Hinduism and the caste system, and I have Judaic and Freemasonic flavor, as well as modern secular terminology in terms of social economic status. But I use the expression often, commonly, in Yeshiva society. As said, it's most related to acceptance of the law. If you say, okay, like you say, Masad, from a religious point of view, is considered a tinek shel nishba, meaning he was kidnapped at childbirth because he wasn't given a proper upbringing in terms of being taught the law and the requirement to be obedient to the law. And should he, in his adult, repent, become familiar with the law and obedient to the law, and realize that up till today, most of his behavior was sinful, from a judgment point of view, he will be judged less harshly because he was not taught the law from youth. That's the common rabbinic understanding. From a modern perspective, you say, well, like, okay, we weren't taught to be an Orthodox Jew and do a bunch of this ritual. Who cares about this ritual? That's not going to help you. So in modern terms, like in America, and separately, there is the IQ debate and the inheritance of IQ, and I didn't talk about that, and it's somewhat separate. They're more talking about, there is also a question of natural ability. And so, high or low birth is a whole gamut of factors that include nature and nurture. So you could have good genes in terms of athleticism, intelligence, attractiveness, so on and so on. Or you could also have rich parents. You could have educated parents. And so in the religious context, in Judaism and Hinduism, it's more in relationship to knowledge of the law and being taught from youth that this is what you should do with your life in order that you don't sin. I mean, so when you become an adult, like within Judaism, generally at bar mitzvah at 13, you are obligated to keep the law. And the Talmud says at the age of 20, after the age of 20, you become liable to punishment for failure to obey the law. So you should start keeping the law at 13. And if you fail to keep the law after 20, you're eligible for punishment. But to some extent, youth, to be perfectly righteous, you should keep the law. Like the Vilna Goan, was, the Goan, meaning he was a child genius and was compliant with the law from the earliest ages. And so the sense you're perfectly righteous, you never sinned, mean you had to be aware of the law. I forgot to use the term, like we're all raised into ignorance. So if you took high birth, even though the natural status of the human child is to be raised into ignorance, that the parents and society taught them in their youth what the law is and how to obey it in order that they could live a life free from sin. So the religious concept focuses more on this living a life free from sin. In terms of the Royal Society or modern conceptions like education, you're talking like the means of, like, okay, like you came from a good family, you went to good schools, you lived in a good neighborhood that had good schools, your parents were able to, buy you a car at 16 and you have your books and tutors and college education, and you didn't have to work or do these extra struggles, so that you could spend your efforts on the things that will help you advance into the management class, and therefore you achieve power, wealth, and success. Could be in terms of like health outcomes of knowing what is healthy or unhealthy, knowledge of the law, American law, how to open up a business, how to file your taxes, bank account, all the various things that, so say if you took high birth, your parents taught you as a young kid, and you say, well, I took low birth, and like I didn't know this stuff. So you could be like a grown man, and like, well, how do you, how do you make a corporation? How do you like start a business, or even like a doctor? Well, I took high birth. I know hundreds of doctors. Like anytime I have a problem, I just consult somebody who knows, because I due to my position of birth, I knew elites and knowledgeable people. You took low birth. Well, I don't know any doctors. I don't know any knowledgeable people. When I'm in a bad situation, I don't know who to ask. I have no one to ask. And so there's parallels to modern society in relationship to, we were talking about week in review, like, Newton, Gauss. I would mention Gauss is the most famous, person who took very low birth. Gauss came from a very poor family, but was recognized as a math genius as a young kid, and elites saw his talent and paid for him to be educated, but he was always subservient to the aristocracy because he never had his own money, and he always needed the sponsorship of people wealthier than him in order for him to pursue math and science. It could be, modern terms of the university system, politics, terms like you want to run for Congress, you got to raise money. Well, I came from a rich family. Like my parents gave me $1 million so I could run for Congress, as opposed to, saying that all these things that require large resources to be able to do. So like Newton, as I will go week in review in the future, deep detail of the people, their biographies, what they had to do to make their accomplishments. Usually they had to apprentice and serve people. And most of the time they had to do it for money. Euler, or that, they became members of the Royal Society, but they needed money because they didn't take high enough birth to have an independent source of money. And Therefore, they had to constantly be doing tasks such as educating the children of the elites or performance of factors for the state. Like Newton eventually became head of the Royal Society, head of the Mint, reached nobility, and died a very wealthy man. But his whole life, he was doing tasks for the aristocracy just in order to um, sub, apply his personal financing in terms of like building up a family. Okay, that have enough resources to do this and to build up a family and progeny. So the status of birth is extremely important, and the canonization process. So say Newton, not only did he come up with these discoveries, he became a member of the Royal Society. He convinced the elites of his generation of his ideas and was able to canonize it. And there existed a body that included the aristocracy of people who took high birth and people who accomplished despite lower birth positions and such, like the Royal Society. And we can review, you could consider that like a good university or Harvard. You could be someone who took low birth and really smart and worked really hard and got to Harvard, but the vast majority of people at Harvard are the children of the aristocracy, and even the children of the 1%. That so you might Jared Kushner or something was a mediocre student. However, he got into Harvard because his grandfather's foundation donated $3 million, and various factors of maybe Jared Kushner. When you look at his biography, like I said, the difference between President Trump and Joe Biden. Biden's always talking about how his dad was struggling and moving from job to job and moving around and could hardly feed the family, as where President Trump entered his father's real estate dynasty. That Fred Trump already owned hundreds of millions of dollars of real estate, and Donald Trump went into the family business and already had tens of millions of dollars of resources to buy and get straight into the real estate business. So like Kushner, his grandfather, Hatchet Joe, started with nothing, building houses. Like the biography of Joe Kushner, Jared Kushner's grandfather, who was a home builder, a contractor, and used to sleep in the houses he worked in. Like he was poor, he got married, and he had to sleep in the houses he was working in, but eventually built over 1,000 houses in a real estate empire that Jared Kushner moved into, buying skyscrapers, large real estate complexes over a multi-general, the benefit of taking high birth. So all these important factors that are really related to every single issue. So like, taxes, even issues like health disparity, in the sense like Head Start, important things that you need to know for your kid to be healthy. That if you take lower birth, you really have no way to figure this out. You say maybe you can't afford a doctor, or you have bad medical care, and you figure this out by trial and error, and God forbid it has negative consequences on your children, and various things like relate to smoking or crime, or things like, well, you should have known better. Well, you didn't know better because you took lower birth and weren't taught the difference between right and wrong, or what will get you ahead or not. There's many aspects like athleticism. To a certain extent, in many fields, you have a lot of people who took lower birth, like professional sports is a mixture. So, like a lot of football and basketball are dominated by people who relatively took lower birth, but they got big and strong, they worked out, and it's indicative of someone who took lower birth that becomes big and strong, a good fighter, a good athlete. Some fields require extensive amounts of investment in education, like skiing. That skiing's very expensive, so it's unlikely you're going to take low birth and become a championship skier, because skiing's expensive, and you're not going to be able to get the experience of skiing to become a championship skier if you don't have the resources. Golf historically was like that, Tiger Woods, and but historically golf was a rich man's sport. Chess is considerable. Chess is simple. Anybody could play chess. However, if you have resources, if your parents could afford coaching, send you to chess camp, computers, books, you're going to have advantage over someone who took lower birth and doesn't have those resources. And so you have these disparate outcomes in all fields, and it's not a moral judgment or good or bad or whether a person's going to heaven or hell. The Judaism says, well, God is just. So if you take higher birth, it is because you're being rewarded. And if you take lower birth, because you're being punished, and it's just an outcome of the theory that God is just, that if you're suffering, it's because you deserve to suffer. If you're being rewarded, it's because you deserve to be rewarded. And so it's general theological principle also in Hinduism. It's just given as is. God is just, God is benevolent, and the cause of our suffering is our own. I mentioned the essay, the interesting, especially related to like the Holocaust and anti-Semitism and some of the rabbinic theory, this concept of suffering on behalf of others, like, the Jesus principle and the righteous. But the Talmud says this crazy concept that, there's this suffering is, you call it a punishment, but it's really a mercy of God, because suffering gives atonement. That sinful behavior needs to be cleansed, and the way to cleanse it is through suffering. And conceptually, that if the generation is sinful, and like the generation should be destroyed, God forbid, that the righteous could suffer on behalf of the generation. So it's okay, God forbid the generation is crap and degenerate and has very little merit and should be destroyed. However, the righteous of the generation step up and allow themselves to take the suffering upon themselves of others, and similar to the Christian principle like ransom or Jesus, but it's saying it's a general Judaic rabbinic principle. And the Talmud says even one step further, that if there's no righteous people of the generation to suffer, that innocent children will suffer. That's the method that God uses, that has, God forbid, like the ahimsa principle, overall harm is reduced. That God forbid society is sinful, and the only way to cleanse society of the sin is through suffering, and either all of society could collapse or innocent children can suffer. So it's a Talmudic, kind of like trolley type problem, where the Talmud is postulating the version of the trolley problem, that the reason why innocent children suffer is because the sins of the generation need to be cleansed. So, it's conceptually very interesting. And there's also conceptions of, children who suffer at birth related to reincarnation, possibly related to the sins of the parents. God forbid, the Talmud, superstitions that thinking immoral thoughts during sexual relation causes your kids to have degenerative diseases like retardation. It's the direct consequence of sinful behavior of the parents. And these are ancient superstitions in the Bible and the Talmud, that is saying the history of this concept of high and low birth. And the biblical, it's more direct. Like people, I mentioned that, it's like, well, it's the Ten Commandments. Ten Commandments says God's a jealous God who causes the suffering of the parents onto the children for 3 and 4 generations, and the reward of the righteous is promised for 1,000 generations. It's bent in terms of reward and righteousness. However, the Ten Commandments clearly lays out that God causes the children to suffer for the sins of the parents, and the righteous will be rewarded. And even like Judaism, so say I'm a Jew, I took high birth, I will get the reward of my ancestors. In terms like Israel, the Jews get Israel, not anything that I did, because my ancestors, that God, the redemption, the prophecy whatever good is coming to the Jews, that's not anything I did. That's something that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob did that I will be rewarded for as a Jew. And that's, conceptually, if you want to go, well, I took high birth, mean to say I have good things coming to me purely due to the actions of my ancestors. And it's not talking like, okay, I'm going to inherit some money when my parents pass away, or thank God, like, if I'm in a bad situation, I could call my parents up and, they hook me up and my parents give me stuff all the time. I'm talking like, no, the biblical prophecies, I have the reward of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob due to me. It's my birthright. You're like Adam Green, Esau, and Jacob. That, I'm sorry, Goy, you will suffer for the sins of your ancestors, and I will be rewarded for the merit of my ancestors. I'm an ancestor of Jacob, and I will reap that reward. And you are an ancestor of, so-and-so, and you will suffer that punishment. I'm sorry. That's the way God made it. And that's kind of like Adam Green's criticism. And you could call it criticism of Judaism in general. And there's different understandings, but it's somewhat, that's just what it says in the Bible and the Talmudic and Kabbalistic literature, although there's dispute in the rabbinic and Kabbalistic literature how to interpret. But this concept of high and low birth is essentially Judaic. And even, when Islam is the most anti-high and low birth of any of the religions, Christianity also has large conception of the Judaic high and low birth, less so than Judaism, Islam less so than Christianity. However, they're still all in the biblical tradition where most mainstream Christians accept the Ten Commandments. And the Ten Commandments, it's you can't really explain it away. The Ten Commandments clearly says that children suffer the sins for the sins of their parents and are rewarded for the sins of their parents. That just part of the Ten Commandments. So, but express it, like if you want to give it unapologetic, unpolitically correct, is that, well, it was God law. I'm not making this stuff up. I'm just subservient. I want my kids to prosper. Like I'm going to be a good person, and my reward will be, God will reward me and my children. And so I'm going to be careful in my action, because if I'm not, God will punish my children for it. And the Bible is straight up like that. You got to be careful, because not only you will be punished for your bad deeds, your children will be punished for your bad deeds. Not only you will be rewarded for your good deeds, your children will be rewarded for your good deeds. And that's not, like straight up like esoteric stuff in the Bible. That's referring to health, wealth, peace, and prosperity. Like, God forbid, if we behave poorly, our kids might have horrible sickness or poverty or war. If we behave well, our kids could have lives of good health, peace, prosperity. So, biblically, there's more straight up a conception of good and bad. That, like, I'm sorry. Like, you had wealthy parents. Your parents must have done something good. That the reward for righteousness is wealth. The punishment for sinful behavior is poverty. So I mentioned in the Bible that said there's a conception before the first temple. It was straightforward. It was always that way, that there was a clear one-to-one correlation between wealth and righteousness and poverty and evilness. That if you saw someone in poverty, you could say you are being punished for your sins or your parents' sins. If you saw someone in a situation of wealth, you say you are being rewarded for your good deeds and your parents' good deeds. After the destruction of the temple, it became more complicated, and there were other things brought in, but still the general biblical conception is, even the roll towards anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism is punishment from God for our bad deeds. That's the straightforward rabbinical biblical interpretation, but of all suffering and reward in general. Although sometimes say that the Talmud says after the destruction of the first temple, it became less transparent, where you can't necessarily just look at a person and their situation and determine from their level of prosperity, whether in societal position, their sinful or righteous behavior. But in modern concept, you're saying in our own, you're saying you shouldn't judge other people negatively. So, rabbinically, you should come up with a way to judge everybody favorably. And so if you see someone suffering, or so to say, taking low birth, even though biblically you say, well, the most likely reason is as punishment for the sins of your ancestors, you judge them favorably. And so, well, maybe you're suffering on behalf of society. Maybe there's some sort of explanation that think apparently say, well, why do like Moses? It could appear that the righteous suffer and the wicked prosper. Or say appear. It only appears like the righteous suffer and the wicked prosper, because in reality, that you say, well, God is just. The righteous do not suffer and the wicked do not prosper. It just appears falsely like, and the righteous are suffering. But if you really understood God's calculation, would say, no, that's not inaccurate, it's just the appearance. In reality, the righteous are, in fact, always being rewarded, and the wicked are always being punished, even if it, for some reason, appears not to be that way. And you mentioned even like, well, in the world to come, in the rabbinic concept, to say, well, okay, I'm a good person, I only did a few bad things, so God is going to extract my punishment in this life so I could go to heaven. Or the wicked person who only did a few good things, or his ancestors only did a few good things, but they might be given tremendous wealth and power in order that they could be banished to hell forever. Because God, double ledger accounting, God is trustworthy to reward people for their good deeds and punish them for their bad deeds. So an evil person, even if they are vast majority evil, have to be rewarded for the good deeds they did. So that the Talmud, the answer to Moses is that sometimes wicked people prosper because they're being rewarded in this lifetime for the few good deeds that they have, in order that they could be permanently cast into hell. Or the opposite, that a righteous person who only has a few bad deeds could appear to have horrible suffering, but is in order that in the next world they could be don't have to be punished for those bad deeds. So say, okay, I'm a righteous person, and God tells me, like, David, you're a pretty good guy. You worked, you tried your best, but you messed up. You messed up. You did those sins. You got to suffer. So you could go to heaven if you suffer a horrible death. Or, you could be reincarnated, or some, like another chance. And say, well, okay, I'll suffer the horrible death in order that I could go to heaven and have a purgatory atonement for the sins that I committed. So, that's the Talmudic concept. And, so it's important to note, because, theologically, you're saying you can't sin and get away with it. It might appear like you could sin and get away with it, but he's saying theologically, like, you can't sin and get away with it. And even as the generation, and to say, well, okay, like, God forbid, I try really hard to live my life free of sin. But if the generation is generally sinful, that God might call upon me to suffer on behalf of the generation. He's like, okay, look, David, you're a pretty righteous guy. You try your best. You avoid sin. However, you know what's going on out there. So either society is going to be destroyed, or you're going to suffer and die a horrible death, God forbid. So you say, well, the righteous person, okay, I don't want society to be destroyed. I don't really want to suffer and die a horrible death, but I will accept the suffering of the generation upon myself in order that other people do not have to suffer. And that is a version of the ahimsa principle. And, so the Kabbalist will say that refers to suffering of innocent children, and that could be like reincarnation, that righteous people are reincarnated into children that suffer, and say, well, in order to prevent God's decree of punishment for our sinful behavior in larger society, that the righteous person agreed to be reincarnated as an innocent child who suffers, and that will have a purgatory effect for the larger society in accordance with the Ahimsa principle. So these are very complicated Judaic principles. It's quite clear in the Talmud, the Kabbalah, that this is the way it works, even like the approach to anti-Semitism and suffering in general. The Talmud says clearly there is no suffering without iniquity. Period. No such phenomenon. There's no such thing as suffering that is not caused by sin. If you see a person suffering, by definition, they are being punished for sinful behavior. That's the Talmudic dicta. It's somewhat logical derivation of theological principles that is largely is atheism in general. They call the problem of evil the problem of suffering, and say, well, like T-jump or something. Well, why do all these innocent people suffer? And say, blasphemy. Never happens. No such thing. No such thing as an innocent person suffering. Talmud says clearly, principle, there is no suffering without iniquity. If you see suffering, it is just the purpose of the suffering is for the person's own benefit. My suffering is not even punishment. Suffering in some sense is reward, because suffering allows me to be cleansed and atoned for my sinful behavior. And there is no suffering without iniquity, as it's stated in the Talmud. And so if you take that as just a core principle of theology, be careful. Saying, well, don't sin. Try your hardest. And they say, well, okay, but I don't know. It's impossible not to sin. There's so many laws. It's so easy, like the Ahimsa principle. It's so easy to cause harm. Like, I try so hard to be a good person, and like I try so hard to do the right thing, and I always fail. Like, everybody's against me. Like David, stood up and tried to defend the Jewish people, but yet everyone thinks that I'm a counter-Semite myself. God forbid. I tried to do the right thing, but it didn't work out. I caused pain. And now the only way to atone for my iniquity is suffering. God forbid. And so they say, well, it took high birth. If I had parents or was born into a situation where there were people who could have told me what to do and what not to do. If I had, the rabbi, my parents, who could have given me the proper advice so that I could have avoided the sinful behavior and therefore don't have to suffer to cleanse myself from my sins. And, your own children. So David, God forbid, I'm scared to have children. Well, the Talmud says that, Cheskiah could have been Messiah and he's punished. He didn't want to have children because he knew his child would be wicked. And his son Manasseh was in fact wicked and turned the kingdom to idol worship, but it's still required to have children is the mitzvah. But to say David's scared to have children because, how I'm going to educate my children the proper ways. They're going to be wicked and sinful, and then they're going to have to suffer as punishment for their sin. And I don't know enough to educate my child to not be bad. I know that my kids will be bad and sinful, and I don't even know enough to stop them. I don't even know enough to stop myself from being sinful, God forbid. So, some deep theology there. We'll talk about it more in Week in Review tomorrow. So thank God I wrote an essay. You can see it was somewhat unedited. I'll probably have to structure it, and I doubt it'll even be ready. I might put it on my blog just so when I look at it tomorrow, people will be able to see it. But it needs a lot of editing. Probably this week, I'll put out an edited version, and hope to continue my research. So, unless there's any @Duvids, Orfeo, thanks for tuning in. Beam me up, Scotty, John, all the people in the chat, thanks for tuning in. I missed your comments last time because a lot of times I don't beam me up Herodotus. I've never heard any evidence Herodotus was a Jew. Mir, I think he writes about dealings with Jews. So I never heard that before. Media Hits, yeah, thanks for tuning in. Oswald, yeah, I was on Luke 4 the other day. God forbid the anti-Semitism. You bring Duvid to talk about it. I don't watch Luke that often, so I mean, I'm more likely to be on Luke if I'm actually watching him and in the chat. So sometimes he just sends invites, and he'll send invites day after day, even if like you're not watching. But I don't even watch his content really, so it's unlikely we're going to be talking that much. But I'm in contact with Luke, so possible. Orfeo, I saw your comments on the last video about the memory. I forget the name of the woman who wrote those books. I actually talked about those books on Week in Review and put a link to those books on memory in Week in Review, but I don't have them in my library. But those are actually good books, and I actually like the Memory Palace, and then the woman who did in England like 100 years ago did the History of Memory, and I would like to go more into detail on that also. The tour of my library this week will conclude the tour of my library. So 20 episodes. Francis Yates. Yeah, so those good books. I've read Francis Yates, and I would actually like to even write an essay about Francis Yates, like in her History of Memory. It's a great book. But I don't own a hard copy of it. And, that book you can get for free online because it's past the copyright, older book. And Week in Review a few months ago, I even shared a free link of Francis Yates' book. So this week will be the last tour of my library. And I'll be doing philosophy, mythology, spirituality, like the three shelves right behind me, the half empty shelf, the top shelves. I have my books on spirituality. I talked a little bit like Madame Blavatsky. Some of them like overlap. I might do the Manny Hall. I also mentioned Freemasonry, but do the Gurdjieff books. Joseph Campbell. Some stuff on philosophy. General theology, some interesting books. So that will conclude my 20 videos now on tour of my library. And then from there, hopefully I will, try to stream weekly on more probably related to multiple truth hypothesis and forwarding my own research. So, hopefully it'll be interesting. Anybody, in my Discord or chat that wants to set up a conversation, you can try to do that. I've kind of fell out of reaching out to people. I paid my taxes this week, so God forbid it's expensive. I want to go. Maybe I'll speak to my mom this week, and like taking high birth, I want to go to the Science of Consciousness conference in Sicily, Italy, and it's expensive. To go to Sicily, like plane ticket's going to cost like $1,500. Hotel room is going to cost probably like 150 euros a night, and food is probably going to cost like $4,000. And I have to take a whole week off. So I want to go to the Science of Consciousness conference at the end of May. But it's a lot of money. It's a week off, and so we'll see. But and I got to renew my passport. I haven't left the country in like decades, but it's still possible over the, so I probably got to do it over the next few weeks because if I got to renew my passport and I got to book a plane, I probably got to book the plane and hotel room like at least a month in advance, probably like 2 months in advance. So I got to move on there the next few weeks. So it's possible still. I'm going to aim to go to the Science of Consciousness conference in Sicily in May. See about that. in that case, I want to move the direction of putting research out, publishing stuff on the multiple truth hypothesis, my thoughts on consciousness-related topics. So we'll see how I'm doing on that, and whether it's worth investing to go to Italy for the Science of Consciousness conference. So you'll see about that, and but either way, I have those Ask the Rabbis I mentioned already a year ago that that I hope to get into on the Hebrew conception of the soul, on the origin of the Jewish-Gentile distinction, the origins of the Noahide laws, the origins of Tikkun Olam, and the Jewish role historically in slavery from biblical times to modern times. So either 4 or 5 Ask the Rabbis, 3 to 5 Ask the Rabbis that hopefully I'll be able to do over the next few months, and then hopefully I'll continue with some sort of weekly stream starting the week after this one related to the multiple truth hypothesis and some of my research after I finish touring my library, or maybe I'll go more in depth on various topics. So, Oswald's been able to recommend or book some guests. I'm not sure if that's so practical or the conversations, but I'm always open if someone has contacts or wants to reach out to set up. In terms of who I would reach out to on my own, it would probably be in terms of relation to the Science of Consciousness conference. That would probably aim towards speaking to people that would increase my credibility and knowledge in the field and make my trip to Italy more worthwhile, of the type names or presenters at the Science of Consciousness conference or related fields. If I'm going to reach out to people, it would probably be in relationship to that. John Wolfe still open to doing more streams and mob talk, but it's kind of died down. Charles Moskowitz hasn't reached out to me since the beginning of the year, but I'm still willing to talk to Charles or Luke, or even Claire. Claire's going to be on Sula this week. Week in review, keeping it going. So it's been over 3 years now, so keep it going. So try to avoid bad karma, and thank God for Jennifer, still working together, advancing our research. So I think I was able to write. I want to move, I want to move towards, we discussed on Week in Review, what I'm trying to move towards and what Jennifer's trying to move towards, and we both feel some sort of reasonable accomplishment of keeping Week in Review going. And especially if I want to move towards actually going to the Science of Consciousness conference. I thought that last week our guest was kind of unfortunate the way that worked out. So, God forbid. Say that was Jennifer's guest. I guess she's the one who found him, and I wish Renault best wishes. No bad intentions on that, but it was unfortunate the way that worked out. So I guess with that, finally close it off. So God bless. Shavua Tov. Have a great week. Almost 4 hours here. So appreciate everyone tuning in. And you'll see you tomorrow night for Week in Review, Wednesday for tour of my library. And you want to talk more, hit me up in my Discord or on Twitter. And God bless.